60 Minutes Rewind.
Until Tulia, Texas became the site of one of the worst miscarriages of justice in recent memory, chances are you had never heard of the place and certainly had never heard of a man named Tom Coleman, an undercover narcotics officer who arrested 46 people, nearly all of them black, on charges of being cocaine dealers and sent many of them to prison for a total of 750 years. That was until the governor of Texas stepped in and pardoned them after a judge accused Tom Coleman of being a liar who falsified evidence, a thief, and a racist. So, who is Tom Coleman? He's a former rodeo cowboy with a spotty record in law enforcement and no experience as an undercover narcotics agent. Nevertheless, he was hired by the local sheriff in 1998 to root out drug dealers in Tulia, a desolate farm town of some 5,000 people which has fallen on hard economic times. The money to hire Coleman came from the U.S. Department of Justice as part of a $500 million effort to fight the war on drugs in rural America. Coleman, posing as a menacing ex-convict with a taste for drugs, infiltrated Tulia's small black community, reporting to his bosses that he had bought more than half a pound of cocaine during his 18-month investigation.
There was a drug problem in Tulia, and there still is a drug. They're selling drugs right now. I guarantee you they are. Why'd I do it for 18 months? Because I hate dope dealers and I hate dope, period. That's it.
Early one morning in 1999, Tom Coleman's efforts culminated in the arrest of 13% of Tulia's adult black population. They were rousted out of bed, paraded in front of local television cameras in handcuffs, many of them half-dressed, and charged with selling cocaine to Tom Coleman at various times over the course of his investigation. The town newspaper declared Tulia's streets cleared of garbage.
The defendants know when it boils down to it, when it boils down to it, they handed me the dope, and I handed them the money.
One of those arrested was 26-year-old Freddie Brookins, Jr., a former high school star athlete with no criminal record. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
That wasn't an investigation. It was just a roundup. A West Texas roundup, that's all it was.
33-year-old Yul Bryant, a sales clerk, was charged with selling $160 worth of cocaine.
And I was getting dressed. When they knocked on the door, I was still in my boxers. They told me where I was going. I didn't need no clothes.
Billy Wafer, a 45-year-old warehouse foreman, was charged with dealing 2.3 grams of cocaine to Tom Coleman.
I guess they wanted to be on the map. They wanted to be on the map by arresting so many and making this the biggest drug bust that they ever had, whether it was done right or wrong.
Why was nearly everyone you arrested black? I mean, there's some people say that you intentionally targeted the black community.
No, they didn't intentionally target anyone in Tulia. It turned out that way. It's just where the road led me.
It may be no coincidence that the road led Tom Coleman to the town's black community. It was well known that he had used racial slurs in front of his superior officers in Tulia.
Everybody's making a big deal. Oh, God, he said words like, oh, let's put him in an electric chair. Well, yeah, the word was bad back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, and 60s, and 70s. But now it's just a common slang, you know? Yeah, I mean, people, you can watch TV and hear that word, you know? It's a greeting.
Coleman told me he used the N-word to fit in with blacks during his investigation, and admits he also used it among his white friends.
The word, yes, sir, I've used that word. I've used it a lot. Yeah, what's up?
Is that a greeting you'd use with me?
Oh, no, sir, not you.
But it's okay to use it around other people?
Yes, sir.
You consider yourself to be a racist?
No, sir.
Do you see how some people might hear what you say and think that you are a racist and that you simply railroaded dozens of people because of their race?
That's been said, yes, sir. But that wasn't the case.
What was the case was that the first defendants to face justice were quickly convicted in 8 separate trials by nearly all white juries. Only one of the jurors was black.
I believe they already had a guilty verdict before any of us even went to court.
They were all given harsh sentences ranging from 20 to 341 years in prison, even though the arrests had turned up no cocaine, no drug paraphernalia, no weapons, no money, or any other signs of drug dealing. The convictions were based solely on the uncorroborated word of Tom Coleman, who had followed none of the standard procedures routinely used in undercover drug operations across the country. Just for the record, did you wear a wire or other recording device?
No, sir.
Did you have any video or photographic evidence that the buys took place?
No, sir.
Did you have any independent eyewitness testimony from another undercover officer?
No, sir.
Did you have any fingerprint evidence?
No, sir.
But don't you want something more than your word?
Mm-hmm.
Another little piece of evidence that can point the finger at that person?
Yes, sir, that would have helped. But that's not how the operation went.
If it went any other way, Coleman claims it would have been too dangerous and may have blown his cover. The only records he made of the supposed drug buys were notes of the names, dates, and places which he scrawled on his leg. On your leg?
Yes, sir.
Why not on a notepad?
Because if I wrote it on a notepad and I left it laying around somewhere, somebody would have found it. And then they would have.
So you just pull up your pant legs and write it down there?
Yes, sir.
Wasn't it hard to keep track of information that you write on your legs?
No, sir.
One of the harshest sentences of all, 90 years, went to Joe Moore, a 60-year-old hog farmer who has lived much of his life in this one-room shack. Authorities described him as the drug kingpin of Tulia.
I didn't even know nothing about a kingpin. I don't even know how a kingpin live or nothing. I don't know nothing about that. But I know they live 30 times better than this. No, 100 times better than this.
Tom Coleman's great success at securing convictions came despite the fact that some of his cases fell apart, like the one against defendant Billy Wafer, who had his case dismissed when he was able to show with time cards that he was at work at the local seed processing plant at the same time that Coleman testified Wafer was selling him cocaine.
It never happened. He's that good. He's that good of a liar that he convinced the DA and the sheriff that really happened.
Defendant Yule Bryan had witnesses who said he was at a fair 50 miles away at the time Coleman said he sold him drugs. And that's not all.
In my police report, he said I was a tall black man with bushy-type hair. I'm 5'7". I haven't had any hair in like 6-7 years. Wasn't me.
Case dismissed. And then there's the case of Tanya White. Coleman says she sold him $190 worth of cocaine in Tulia on October 9th, 1998 at 10:15 a.m.
That's not possible because I was at the bank in Oklahoma City at 9:45, withdrawing $8, and they got my signature on my withdrawal slip.
How do you explain that?
Well, all I know is she was in Tulia selling me dope on that day.
But how could she be at the bank cashing a check at the same time?
If I wanted to, I could deposit a check in your bank account without you being there.
No, but this has her signature on it, and it was an assisted transaction. So that means that she had to deal with the teller who was there.
Mm-hmm.
So this record is not good enough for you?
No, it's not good enough for me.
It was good enough to get the case against Tanya White dismissed. But her 3 siblings, Donnie, Crimmy, and Kizzy, a young mother of 2, were not so fortunate. They had already been sentenced to a total of 99 years in prison. Elaine Jones, head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, spearheaded the effort to free the Tulia defendants. She says what happened there defies logic.
How do 46 drug dealers function in a community of 5,000 people? What's the client base? The market isn't there. Who are 46 drug dealers selling drugs to?
He insists to this day that no matter what anyone says, those defendants in Tulia are guilty.
The defendants in Tulia are guilty of being black and of living in Tulia. That's what they're guilty of.
The jurors in the Tulia trials never heard what Tom Coleman's superiors knew about his checkered background when they hired him.
We spoke with 5 of the jurors from 2 of the Tulia trials. You don't think any of these 46 or so people are innocent?
Nope. It'd be real nice if they were. It'd be really easy to get on the other side of it. No.
And if these are the people that we have to get rid of, then let it be.
As the first defendants disappeared behind long prison sentences, 3 we talked to said they felt their choice was clear: plead guilty and take a deal, or go to trial and get the maximum.
You know, I took one look at all those people in the courtroom. You know, it was like, why come there's just nothing but white people in here?
At his trial, Joe Henderson got his first look at the case file and says he was startled by what he saw. The name on the file was not his, but that of his father, Cleveland Joe Henderson Sr., a convicted felon in prison at the time. There was also a photo, not of him, but of his father.
I'm his son. I'm his blood son, but I'm nothing like him.
Yet Henderson told us he was afraid to gamble with a jury, so he pleaded guilty in exchange for 5 years probation. Most of the white residents we spoke with supported the sheriff's decision to execute the raid, but the Tulia defendants found an unlikely ally in an unexpected place. A local wheat and cattle farmer named Gary Gardner has taken up their cause and taken on the white community.
I initially picked up on the raid on television, Channel 7, one morning. And they had images of black people being dragged across the courthouse lawn in their underwear and their hair uncombed, like they weren't humans.
Gardner is an outspoken critic of the local sheriff's war on drugs.
In this county, when someone says drug dealer, they're talking about a person of black skin.
A plain-spoken man who uses the N-word freely when the camera isn't rolling, Gardner is at first blush an unlikely ally for the Tulia defendants. But after the arrests, he says something just didn't sit right.
I knew that we didn't have 46 drug dealers in Tulia.
Why not?
We only got 5,000 people. Who are you going to sell to? They can't be that many.
So Gardner sat through several of the trials, and he started digging.
I'm just an old dumb farmer, and all you got to do is sit down and go over the police reports, and it's there, black and white, and the evidence isn't there.
Take Ramona Strickland. She was indicted on 1 count of selling powdered cocaine. In the police report, Coleman describes her as a black female, 150 pounds. But as you can see, part of the report has been scratched out.
I used my little handheld microscope that I checked boll weevil eggs with. After about 6 or 7 hours under the microscope, I deciphered that scratched out part of that police report.
This is what Gardner saw.
Approximately 6 months pregnant.
But Ramona Strickland says she wasn't pregnant.
I haven't been pregnant since I had my little girl. She's 6 years old.
Nonetheless, she took a plea and paid a fine rather than risk a jury trial. But there were questions about Coleman's undercover methods. But what about Coleman himself? In a letter to the Tulia Herald, Coleman wrote he was only trying to protect decent citizens from drug dealers.
Katherine, Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the global system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, May 1, 2026. So I have been told. This is our 3rd study session on lying. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. We're picking up Chapter 1, The Death of Slavery. We kind of heard a teaspoon of 2 different reports at the beginning. First, we heard 60 Minutes from many decades ago, in fact, and then we heard ABC News, Jamie Floyd, actually 2020 on ABC. They did a whole segment on Tulia as well. I tried to get to important facets of both of those reports. I thought it was important. Michelle Alexander did mention Tulia briefly. last week and even mentioned that as an incident of racism against the black citizens. But she doesn't really give us enough detail, at least in my opinion. I understand this is at the beginning of the book, her intro to the whole thesis that we're going to be talking about here. But even right there in old Tulia, Texas, man, all them bushy-haired Negroes getting snatched out in the early morning hours, and that is right out of Delectable Negro, where Vincent Woodard told us that black slaves, you don't even have autonomy to decide if you can have a stitch of clothing on your genitals. The man and the woman, they get to make that decision. You see that right there where you got black males and black females at the crack of dawn, snatched out of bed, and you heard him say that, I'm in my boxers. I'm in my nightgown. Can I put some clothes on? You don't need no clothes where you going. Even that is kind of homo. Where do you go in public where you leave your residence and you don't need clothes? You fill in the blank on that one. Anyway, but I thought it was important in terms of what she did not include in terms of, okay, yeah, you got old racist Tom Coleman, the investigator criminal. And yeah, you got old racist Sheriff Larry Stewart. Okay, got all that. But what about the rest of the white people in the town? You heard some of the defendants, these privileged black males and such, because it's mostly privileged black males. But you heard some of these black males, and they said, man, I went in and took one look around the courtroom. You didn't hear him say, just colorblind. I'm just looking around. He said, oh, man. I looked around and said, ain't no black. It's just all these white people. Oh, Lord. I'm in trouble. I ain't even sold no cocaine. I'm in trouble. Ooh-wee. I'm going to go ahead and plead anything you tell me to plead because I know this is not going to work out for me. And you heard that from several black people. And they did say mostly all white jurors. I think they said it was one black person that snuck on a jury. And they probably was side-eyeing him the whole time. Well, I don't even know how you got here. We're going to find out where you live. Hey, man, come on. But in my view, that's not colorblind. And it's not just that component that, the jury's all white, blah, blah, blah. It was once this information was revealed, and he's the Tom Coleman investigator is writing down, suspected race soldier Tom Coleman is writing information down on his leg. Are y'all so cheap in Tulia, Texas, you can't even get a shred of paper? You can't even get recycled paper? You get a brown paper bag and write on that. Right on my leg, get it on my thigh here, and just remember it for later on. I say, even after they heard all the information, no evidence of the cocaine to show for, just white person's word, who apparently has been lying on the stand under oath. And they said most of the people in the town, we all right with it. We don't have no pride. You're getting trash off the streets of Tulia. That's what they put on the front page of the paper. Talking about the black people. Black people, trash. Black people, trash. That's not colorblind. Matter of fact, you done told us everything. We all right with it. This is a bunch of black people. We all right with it. And they said, and a white woman who was cowbelling with a black dude. We all right with it. That's what's supposed to be happening. You got drug dealer, black skin. Drug dealer, black skin. Now, importantly, they said that they got an unlikely supporter. Who was the unlikely supporter? Gary Gardner. Gary Gardner said, hey, I'm just an old dumb farmer, white man. I'm just looking, and they done arrested all these half-nude, naked black people at the crack of dawn, and then they don't have no evidence. He said, hey, I got enough time. I went to some of the trials. That's what Gus T liked to do. I went to Sade C. Robinson. So I went to some of the trials. Oh, my goodness. They don't even have evidence. He said, then, if you listen to the same enforcement officers at different trials, you hear different lies. How is that? Come on. And not all white peoples is racist. Slow down. They said, Mr. Gardner, they didn't say he was racist. They said Mr. Gardner is a plain-spoken man. Say Negro all the time. Now, he had some discipline. I ain't going to say Negro while I'm talking to the nice folks for 2020, but as soon as y'all hear them Negroes, woo, they was naked Negroes to start my morning in Tulia. We're going to go ahead and get to it. Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, Lion Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, Katherine Massey Book Club, audio segment 1.
The death of slavery. The history of racial caste in the United States would end with the Civil War if the idea of race and racial difference had died when the institution of slavery was put to rest. But during the 4 centuries in which slavery flourished, the idea of race flourished as well. Indeed, the notion of racial difference, specifically the notion of white supremacy, proved far more durable than the institution that gave birth to it. White supremacy, over time, became a religion of sorts. Faith in the idea that people of the African race were bestial, that whites were inherently superior, and that slavery was, in fact, for blacks' own good, served to alleviate the white conscience and reconcile the tension between slavery and the democratic ideals espoused by whites in the so-called New World. There was no contradiction in the bold claim made by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal if Africans were not really people. Racism operated as a deeply held belief system based on truths beyond question or doubt. This deep faith in white supremacy not only justified an economic and political system in which plantation owners acquired land and great wealth through the brutality, torture, and coercion of other human beings, it also endured, like most articles of faith, long after the historical circumstances that gave rise to the religion passed away. In Watkins' words, racial division was a consequence, not a precondition of slavery, but once it was instituted it became detached from its initial function and acquired a social potency all its own. After the death of slavery, the idea of race lived on. One of the most compelling accounts of the post-emancipation period is The Strange Career of Jim Crow, written by C. Van Woodward in 1955. The book continues to be the focal point of study and debate by scholars and was once described by Martin Luther King Jr. as the historical Bible of the civil rights movement. As Woodward tells the story, the end of slavery created an extraordinary dilemma for Southern white society. Without the labor of former slaves, the region's economy would surely collapse, and without the institution of slavery, there was no longer a formal mechanism for maintaining racial hierarchy and preventing amalgamation with a group of people considered intrinsically inferior and vile. This state of affairs produced a temporary anarchy and a state of mind bordering on hysteria, particularly among the planter elite. But even among poor whites, the collapse of slavery was a bitter pill. In the antebellum South, the lowliest white person at least possessed his or her white skin, a badge of superiority over even the most skilled slave or prosperous free African American. While Southern whites, poor and rich alike, were utterly outraged by emancipation, there was no obvious solution to the dilemma they faced. Following the Civil War, the economic and political infrastructure of the South was in shambles. Plantation owners were suddenly destitute, and state governments, shackled by war debt, were penniless. Large amounts of real estate and other property had been destroyed in the war, industry was disorganized, and hundreds of thousands of men had been killed or maimed. With all of this went the demoralizing effect of an unsuccessful war and the extraordinary challenges associated with rebuilding new state and local governments. Add to all this the sudden presence of 4 million newly freed slaves, and the picture becomes even more complicated. Southern whites, Woodward explains, strongly believed that a new system of racial control was clearly required, but it was not immediately obvious what form it should take. Under slavery, the racial order was most effectively maintained by a large degree of contact between slave owners and slaves, thus maximizing opportunities for supervision and discipline, and minimizing the potential for active resistance or rebellion. Strict separation of the races would have threatened slaveholders' immediate interests and was, in any event, wholly unnecessary as a means of creating social distance or establishing the inferior status of slaves. Following the Civil War, it was unclear what institutions, laws, or customs would be necessary to maintain white control now that slavery was gone. Nonetheless, as numerous historians have shown, the development of a new racial order became the consuming passion for most white Southerners. Rumors of a great insurrection terrified whites, and blacks increasingly came to be viewed as menacing and dangerous. In fact, the current stereotypes of black men as aggressive, unruly predators can be traced to this period, when whites feared that an angry mass of black men might rise up and attack them or rape their women. Equally worrisome was the state of the economy. Former slaves literally walked away from their plantations, causing panic and outrage among plantation owners. Large numbers of former slaves roamed the highways in the early years after the war. Some converged on towns and cities, others joined the federal militia. Most white people believed African Americans lacked the proper motivation to work, prompting the provisional Southern legislatures to adopt the notorious black codes. As expressed by one Alabama planter, "We have the power to pass stringent police laws to govern the Negroes. This is a blessing, for they must be controlled in some way or white people cannot live among them." While some of these codes were intended to establish systems of peonage resembling slavery, others foreshadowed Jim Crow laws by prohibiting, among other things, interracial seating in the first-class sections of railroad cars and by segregating schools. Although the convict laws enacted during this period are rarely seen as part of the black codes, that is a mistake. As explained by historian William Cohen, the main purpose of the codes was to control the freedmen, and the question of how to handle convicted black lawbreakers was very much at the center of the control issue. 9 Southern states adopted vagrancy laws, which essentially made it a criminal offense not to work and were applied selectively to blacks, and 8 of those states enacted convict laws allowing for the hiring out of county prisoners to plantation owners and private companies. Prisoners were forced to work for little or no pay. One Vagrancy Act specifically provided that all free Negroes and mulattoes over the age of 18 must have written proof of a job at the beginning of every year. Those found with no lawful employment were deemed vagrants and convicted. Clearly, the purpose of the black codes in general and the vagrancy laws in particular was to establish another system of forced labor. In W.E.B. Du Bois' words, the codes spoke for themselves. No open-minded student can read them without being convinced they meant nothing more nor less than slavery and daily toil. Ultimately, the black codes were overturned, and a slew of federal civil rights legislation protecting the newly freed slaves was passed during the relatively brief but extraordinary period of black advancement known as the Reconstruction era. The impressive legislative achievements of this period include the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, bestowing full citizenship upon African Americans, the 14th Amendment, prohibiting states from denying citizens due process and equal protection of the laws, the 15th Amendment, providing that the right to vote should not be denied on account of race, and the Ku Klux Klan Acts, which, among other things, declared interference with voting a federal offense and the violent infringement of civil rights a crime. The new legislation also provided for federal supervision of voting and authorized the president to send the army and suspend the writ of habeas corpus in districts declared to be in a state of insurrection against the federal government. In addition to federal civil rights legislation, the Reconstruction era brought the expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau, the agency charged with the responsibility of providing food, clothing, fuel, and other forms of assistance to destitute former slaves. A public education system emerged in the South, which afforded many blacks, and poor whites, their first opportunity to learn to read and write. While the Reconstruction era was fraught with corruption and arguably doomed by the lack of land reform, the sweeping economic and political developments in that period did appear, at least for a time, to have the potential to seriously undermine, if not completely eradicate, the racial caste system in the South. With the protection of federal troops, African Americans began to vote in large numbers and seize control, in some areas, of the local political apparatus. Literacy rates climbed, and educated blacks began to populate legislatures, open schools, and initiate successful businesses. In 1867, at the dawn of the Reconstruction era, no black man held political office in the South, yet 3 years later, at least 15% of all Southern elected officials were black. This is particularly extraordinary in light of the fact that 15 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the high watermark of the civil rights movement, fewer than 8% of all Southern elected officials were black. At the same time, however, many of the new civil rights laws were proving largely symbolic. Notably absent from the 15th Amendment, for example, was language prohibiting the states from imposing educational, residential, or other qualifications for voting, thus leaving the door open to the states to impose poll taxes, literacy tests, and other devices to prevent blacks from voting. Other laws revealed themselves as more an assertion of principle than direct federal intervention into Southern affairs, because enforcement required African Americans to take their cases to federal courts, a costly and time-consuming procedure that was a practical impossibility for the vast majority of those who had claims. Most blacks were too poor to sue to enforce their civil rights, and no organization like the NAACP yet existed to spread the risks and costs of litigation. Moreover, the threat of violence often deterred blacks from pressing legitimate claims, making the civil rights of former slaves largely illusory, existing on paper but rarely to be found in real life. Meanwhile, the separation of the races had begun to emerge as a comprehensive pattern throughout the South, driven in large part by the rhetoric of the planter elite, who hoped to re-establish a system of control that would ensure a low-paid, submissive labor force. Racial segregation had actually begun years earlier in the North, as an effort to prevent race mixing and preserve racial hierarchy following the abolition of Northern slavery. It had never developed, however, into a comprehensive system, operating instead largely as a matter of custom, enforced with varying degrees of consistency. Even among those most hostile to Reconstruction, few would have predicted that racial segregation would soon evolve into a new racial caste system as stunningly comprehensive and repressive as the one that came to be known simply as Jim Crow. The birth of Jim Crow. The backlash against the gains of African Americans in the Reconstruction era was swift and severe. As African Americans obtained political power and began the long march toward greater social and economic equality, whites reacted with panic and outrage. Southern conservatives vowed to reverse Reconstruction and sought the abolition of the Freedmen's Bureau and all political instrumentalities designed to secure Negro supremacy. Their campaign to redeem the South was reinforced by a resurgent Ku Klux Klan, which fought a terrorist campaign against Reconstruction governments and local leaders, complete with bombings, lynchings, and mob violence. The terrorist campaign proved highly successful. Redemption resulted in the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and the effective abandonment of African Americans and all those who had fought for or supported an egalitarian racial order. The federal government no longer made any effort to enforce federal civil rights legislation, and funding for the Freedmen's Bureau was slashed to such a degree that the agency became virtually defunct. Once again, vagrancy laws and other laws defining activities such as mischief and insulting gestures as crimes were enforced vigorously against blacks. The aggressive enforcement of these criminal offenses opened up an enormous market for convict leasing, in which prisoners were contracted out as laborers to the highest private bidder. Douglas Blackman, in Slavery by Another Name, describes how tens of thousands of African Americans were arbitrarily arrested during this period, many of them hit with court costs and fines, which had to be worked off in order to secure their release. 18 With no means to pay off their debts, prisoners were sold as forced laborers to lumber camps, brickyards, railroads, farms, plantations, and dozens of corporations throughout the South. Death rates were shockingly high, for the private contractors had no interest in the health and well-being of their laborers, unlike the earlier slave owners who needed their slaves, at a minimum, to be healthy enough to survive hard labor. Laborers were subject to almost continual lashing by long horsewhips, and those who collapsed due to injuries or exhaustion were often left to die. Convicts had no meaningful legal rights at this time and no effective redress. They were understood, quite literally, to be slaves of the state. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution had abolished slavery but allowed one major exception: slavery remained appropriate as punishment for a crime. In a landmark decision by the Virginia Supreme Court, Ruffin v. Commonwealth, issued at the height of Southern redemption, the court put to rest any notion that convicts were legally distinguishable from slaves. For a time, during his service in the penitentiary, he is in a state of penal servitude to the state. He has, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights except those which the law in its humanity accords to him. He is for the time being a slave of the state. He is civiliter mortis, and his estate, if he has any, is administered like that of a dead man. The state of Mississippi eventually moved from hiring convict labor to organizing its own convict labor camp, known as Parchman Farm. It was not alone. During the decade following redemption, the convict population grew 10 times faster than the general population, prisoners became younger and blacker, and the length of their sentences soared. It was the nation's first prison boom and, as they are today, the prisoners were disproportionately black. After a brief period of progress during Reconstruction, African Americans found themselves, once again, virtually defenseless. The criminal justice system was strategically employed to force African Americans back into a system of extreme repression and control, a tactic that would continue to prove successful for generations to come. Even as convict leasing faded away, strategic forms of exploitation and repression emerged anew. As Blackman notes, the apparent demise of leasing prisoners seemed a harbinger of a new day. But the harsher reality of the South was that the new post-Civil War neo-slavery was evolving, not disappearing. Redemption marked a turning point in the quest by dominant whites for a new racial equilibrium, a racial order that would protect their economic, political, and social interests in a world without slavery. Yet a clear consensus among whites about what the new racial order should be was still lacking. The redeemers who overthrew Reconstruction were inclined to retain such segregation practices as had already emerged, but they displayed no apparent disposition to expand or universalize the system. 3 alternative philosophies of race relations were put forward to compete for the region's support, all of which rejected the doctrines of extreme racism espoused by some redeemers: liberalism, conservatism, and radicalism. The liberal philosophy of race relations emphasized the stigma of segregation and the hypocrisy of a government that celebrates freedom and equality yet denies both on account of race. This philosophy, born in the North, never gained much traction among Southern whites or blacks. The conservative philosophy, by contrast, attracted wide support and was implemented in various contexts over a considerable period of time. Conservatives blamed liberals for pushing blacks ahead of their proper station in life and placing blacks in positions they were unprepared to fill, a circumstance that had allegedly contributed to their downfall. They warned blacks that some redeemers were not satisfied with having decimated Reconstruction, and were prepared to wage an aggressive war against blacks throughout the South. With some success, the conservatives reached out to African American voters, reminding them that they had something to lose as well as gain and that the liberals' preoccupation with political and economic equality presented the danger of losing all that blacks had so far gained. The radical philosophy offered, for many African Americans, the most promise. It was predicated on a searing critique of large corporations, particularly railroads, and the wealthy elite in the North and South. The radicals of the late 19th century, who later formed the Populist Party, viewed the privileged classes as conspiring to keep poor whites and blacks locked into a subordinate political and economic position. For many African American voters, the populist approach was preferable to the paternalism of liberals. Populists preached an equalitarianism of want and poverty, the kinship of a common grievance, and a common oppressor. As described by Tom Watson, a prominent populist leader, in a speech advocating a union between black and white farmers, "You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism that enslaves you both. You are deceived and blinded that you may not see how this race antagonism perpetuates a monetary system which beggars both." In an effort to demonstrate their commitment to a genuinely multiracial, working-class movement against white elites, the populists made strides toward racial integration, a symbol of their commitment to class-based unity. African Americans throughout the South responded with great hope and enthusiasm, eager to be true partners in a struggle for social justice. According to Woodward, it is altogether probable that during the brief populist upheaval in the 90s, Negroes and native whites achieved a greater comedy of mind and harmony of political purpose than ever before or since in the South. The challenges inherent in creating the alliance sought by the populists were formidable, as race prejudice ran the highest among the very white populations to which the populist appeal was specifically addressed, the depressed lower economic classes. Nevertheless, the populist movement initially enjoyed remarkable success in the South, fueled by a wave of discontent aroused by the severe agrarian depression of the 1880s and 1890s. The populists took direct aim at the conservatives, who were known as comprising a party of privilege, and they achieved a stunning series of political victories throughout the region. Alarmed by the success of the populists and the apparent potency of the alliance between poor and working-class whites and African Americans, the conservatives raised the cry of white supremacy and resorted to the tactics they had employed in their quest for redemption, including fraud, intimidation, bribery, and terror. Segregation laws were proposed as part of a deliberate effort to drive a wedge between poor whites and African Americans. These discriminatory barriers were designed to encourage lower-class whites to retain a sense of superiority over blacks, making it far less likely that they would sustain interracial political alliances aimed at toppling the white elite. The laws were, in effect, another racial bribe. As William Julius Wilson has noted, as long as poor whites directed their hatred and frustration against the black competitor, the planters were relieved of class hostility directed against them. Indeed, in order to overcome the well-founded suspicions of poor and illiterate whites that they, as well as blacks, were in danger of losing the right to vote, the leaders of the movement pursued an aggressive campaign of white supremacy in every state prior to black disenfranchisement. Ultimately, the populists caved to the pressure and abandoned their former allies. While the populist movement was at the peak of zeal, Woodward observed, the two races had surprised each other and astonished their opponents by the harmony they achieved and the goodwill with which they cooperated. But when it became clear that the conservatives would stop at nothing to decimate their alliance, the biracial partnership dissolved, and populist leaders realigned themselves with conservatives. Even Tom Watson, who had been among the most forceful advocates for an interracial alliance of farmers, concluded that populist principles could never be fully embraced by the South until blacks were eliminated from politics. The agricultural depression, taken together with a series of failed reforms and broken political promises, had pyramided to a climax of social tensions. Dominant whites concluded that it was in their political and economic interest to scapegoat blacks, and permission to hate came from sources that had formerly denied it, including Northern liberals eager to reconcile with the South, Southern conservatives who had once promised blacks protection from racial extremism, and populists, who cast aside their dark-skinned allies when the partnership fell under siege. History seemed to repeat itself. Just as the white elite had successfully driven a wedge between poor whites and blacks following Bacon's Rebellion by creating the institution of black slavery, another racial caste system was emerging nearly 2 centuries later, in part due to efforts by white elites to decimate a multiracial alliance of poor people. By the turn of the 20th century, every state in the South had laws on the books that disenfranchised blacks and discriminated against them in virtually every sphere of life, lending sanction to a racial ostracism that extended to schools, churches, housing, jobs, restrooms, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, orphanages, prisons, funeral homes, morgues, and cemeteries. Politicians competed with each other by proposing and passing ever more stringent, oppressive, and downright ridiculous legislation, such as laws specifically prohibiting blacks and whites from playing chess together. The public symbols and constant reminders of black subjugation were supported by whites across the political spectrum, though the plight of poor whites remained largely unchanged. For them, the racial bribe was primarily psychological. The new racial order, known as Jim Crow, a term apparently derived from a minstrel show character, was regarded as the final settlement, the return to sanity, and the permanent system. Of course, the earlier system of racialized social control, slavery, had also been regarded as final, sane, and permanent by its supporters. Like the earlier system, Jim Crow seemed natural, and it became difficult to remember that alternative paths were not only available at one time, but nearly embraced. The death of Jim Crow. Scholars have long debated the beginning and end of Reconstruction, as well as exactly when Jim Crow ended and the Civil Rights Movement or Second Reconstruction began. Reconstruction is most typically described as stretching from 1863 when the North freed the slaves to 1877, when it abandoned them and withdrew federal troops from the South. There is much less certainty regarding the beginning of the end of Jim Crow. The general public typically traces the death of Jim Crow to Brown v. Board of Education, although the institution was showing signs of weakness years before. By 1945, a growing number of whites in the North had concluded that the Jim Crow system would have to be modified, if not entirely overthrown. This consensus was due to a number of factors, including the increased political power of blacks due to migration to the North and the growing membership and influence of the NAACP, particularly its highly successful legal campaign challenging Jim Crow laws in federal courts. Far more important in the view of many scholars, however, is the influence of World War II. The blatant contradiction between the country's opposition to the crimes of the Third Reich against European Jews and the continued existence of a racial caste system in the United States was proving embarrassing, severely damaging the nation's credibility as leader of the free world. There was also increased concern that, without greater equality for African Americans, blacks would become susceptible to communist influence, given Russia's commitment to both racial and economic equality. In Gunnar Myrdal's highly influential book The American Dilemma, published in 1944, Myrdal made a passionate plea for integration based on the theory that the inherent contradiction between the American creed of freedom and equality and the treatment of African Americans was not only immoral and profoundly unjust, but was also against the economic and foreign policy interests of the United States. The Supreme Court seemed to agree. In 1944, in Smith v. Allwright, the Supreme Court ended the use of the all-white primary election, and in 1946, the court ruled that state laws requiring segregation on interstate buses were unconstitutional. 2 years later, the court voided any real estate agreements that racially discriminated against purchasers, and in 1949 the court ruled that Texas's segregated law school for blacks was inherently unequal and inferior in every respect to its law school for whites. In 1950, in McLaurin v. Oklahoma, it declared that Oklahoma had to desegregate its law school. Thus, even before Brown, the Supreme Court had already begun to set in motion a striking pattern of desegregation. Brown v. Board of Education was unique, however. It signaled the end of home rule in the South with respect to racial affairs. Earlier decisions had chipped away at the separate but equal doctrine, yet Jim Crow had managed to adapt to the changing legal environment, and most Southerners had remained confident that the institution would survive. Brown threatened not only to abolish segregation in public schools, but also, by implication, the entire system of legalized discrimination in the South. After more than 50 years of nearly complete deference to Southern states and non-interference in their racial affairs, Brown suggested a reversal in course. A mood of outrage and defiance swept the South, not unlike the reaction to emancipation and Reconstruction following the Civil War. Again, racial equality was being forced upon the South by the federal government, and by 1956 Southern white opposition to desegregation mushroomed into a vicious backlash. In Congress, North Carolina Senator Sam Erwin Jr. drafted a racist polemic, the Southern Manifesto, which vowed to fight to maintain Jim Crow by all legal means. Erwin succeeded in obtaining the support of 101 out of 128 members of Congress from the 11 original Confederate states. A fresh wave of white terror was hurled at those who supported the dismantling of Jim Crow. White citizens' councils were formed in almost every Southern city and backwater town, comprised primarily of middle to upper middle-class whites in business and the clergy. Just as Southern legislatures had passed the black codes in response to the early steps of Reconstruction, in the years immediately following Brown v. Board, 5 Southern legislatures passed nearly 50 new Jim Crow laws. In the streets, resistance turned violent. The Ku Klux Klan reasserted itself as a powerful terrorist organization, committing castrations, killings, and the bombing of black homes and churches. NAACP leaders were beaten, pistol-whipped, and shot. As quickly as it began, desegregation across the South ground to a halt. In 1958, 13 school systems were desegregated, in 1960, only 17. In the absence of a massive, grassroots movement directly challenging the racial caste system, Jim Crow might be alive and well today. Yet in the 1950s, a civil rights movement was brewing, emboldened by the Supreme Court's decisions and a shifting domestic and international political environment. With extraordinary bravery, civil rights leaders, activists, and progressive clergy launched boycotts, marches, and sit-ins protesting the Jim Crow system. They endured fire hoses, police dogs, bombings, and beatings by white mobs, as well as by the police. Once again, federal troops were sent to the South to provide protection for blacks attempting to exercise their civil rights, and a violent reaction of white racists was met with horror in the North. The dramatic high point of the civil rights movement occurred in 1963. The Southern struggle had grown from a modest group of black students demonstrating peacefully at one lunch counter to the largest mass movement for racial reform and civil rights in the 20th century. Between autumn 1961 and the spring of 1963, 20,000 men, women, and children had been arrested. In 1963 alone, another 15,000 were imprisoned, and 1,000 desegregation protests occurred across the region, in more than 100 cities. On June 12, 1963, President Kennedy announced that he would deliver to Congress a strong civil rights bill, a declaration that transformed him into a widely recognized ally of the civil rights movement. Following Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson professed his commitment to the goal of the full assimilation of more than 20 million Negroes into American life, and ensured the passage of comprehensive civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 formally dismantled the Jim Crow system of discrimination in public accommodations, employment, voting, education, and federally financed activities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 arguably had even greater scope, as it rendered illegal numerous discriminatory barriers to effective political participation by African Americans and mandated federal review of all new voting regulations so that it would be possible to determine whether their use would perpetuate voting discrimination. Within 5 years, the effects of the Civil Rights Revolution were undeniable. Between 1964 and 1969, the percentage of African American adults registered to vote in the South soared. In Alabama, the rate leaped from 19.3% to 61.3%, in Georgia, 27.4% to 60.4%, in Louisiana, 31.6% to 60.8%, and in Mississippi, 6.7% to 66.5%. Suddenly black children could shop in department stores, eat at restaurants, drink from water fountains, and go to amusement parks that were once off limits. Miscegenation laws were declared unconstitutional, and the rate of interracial marriage climbed. While dramatic progress was apparent in the political and social realms, civil rights activists became increasingly concerned that, without major economic reforms, the vast majority of blacks would remain locked in poverty. Thus, at the peak of the civil rights movement, activists and others began to turn their attention to economic problems, arguing that socioeconomic inequality interacted with racism to produce crippling poverty and related social problems. Economic issues emerged as a major focus of discontent. As political scientists Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward have described, blacks became more indignant over their condition, not only as an oppressed racial minority in a white society but as poor people in an affluent one. Activists organized boycotts, picket lines, and demonstrations to attack discrimination in access to jobs and the denial of economic opportunity. Perhaps the most famous demonstration in support of economic justice is the March on Washington for Jobs and Economic Freedom in August 1963. The wave of activism associated with economic justice helped to focus President Kennedy's attention on poverty and black unemployment. In the summer of 1963, he initiated a series of staff studies on those subjects. By the end of the summer, he declared his intention to make the eradication of poverty a key legislative objective in 1964. Following Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon Johnson embraced the anti-poverty rhetoric with great passion, calling for an unconditional war on poverty, in his State of the Union address in January 1964. Weeks later he proposed to Congress the Economic Opportunities Bill of 1964. The shift in focus served to align the goals of the civil rights movement with key political goals of poor and working-class whites, who were also demanding economic reforms. As the civil rights movement began to evolve into a poor people's movement, it promised to address not only black poverty, but white poverty as well, thus raising the specter of a poor and working-class movement that cut across racial lines. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders made it clear that they viewed the eradication of economic inequality as the next front in the human rights movement and made great efforts to build multiracial coalitions that sought economic justice for all. Genuine equality for black people, King reasoned, demanded a radical restructuring of society, one that would address the needs of the black and white poor throughout the country. Shortly before his assassination, he envisioned bringing to Washington, D.C., thousands of the nation's disadvantaged in an interracial alliance that embraced rural and ghetto blacks, Appalachian whites, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Native Americans to demand jobs and income, the right to live. In a speech delivered in 1968, King acknowledged there had been some progress for blacks since the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but insisted that the current challenges required even greater resolve and that the entire nation must be transformed for economic justice to be more than a dream for poor people of all colors. As historian Gerald McKnight observes, King was proposing nothing less than a radical transformation of the civil rights movement into a populist crusade calling for redistribution of economic and political power. America's only civil rights leader was now focusing on class issues and was planning to descend on Washington with an army of poor to shake the foundations of the power structure and force the government to respond to the needs of the ignored underclass. With the success of the civil rights movement and the launching of the Poor People's Movement, it was apparent to all that a major disruption in the nation's racial equilibrium had occurred, yet as we shall see below, Negroes stood only a brief moment in the sun. Conservative whites began, once again, to search for a new racial order that would conform to the needs and constraints of the time. This process took place with the understanding that whatever the new order would be, it would have to be formally race-neutral, it could not involve explicit or clearly intentional race discrimination. A similar phenomenon had followed slavery and Reconstruction, as white elites struggled to define a new racial order with the understanding that whatever the new order would be, it could not include slavery. Jim Crow eventually replaced slavery, but now it too had died, and it was unclear what might take its place. Barred by law from invoking race explicitly, those committed to racial hierarchy were forced to search for new means of achieving their goals according to the new rules of American democracy. History reveals that the seeds of the new system of control were planted well before the end of the civil rights movement. A new race-neutral language was developed for appealing to old racist sentiments, a language accompanied by a political movement that succeeded in putting the vast majority of blacks back in their place. Proponents of racial hierarchy found they could install a new racial caste system without violating the law or the new limits of acceptable political discourse, by demanding law and order rather than segregation forever. The birth of mass incarceration. The rhetoric of law and order was first mobilized in the late 1950s as Southern governors and law enforcement officials attempted to generate and mobilize white opposition to the civil rights movement. In the years following Brown v. Board of Education, civil rights activists used direct action tactics in an effort to force reluctant Southern states to desegregate public facilities. Southern governors and law enforcement officials often characterized these tactics as criminal and argued that the rise of the civil rights movement was indicative of a breakdown of law and order. Support of civil rights legislation was derided by Southern conservatives as merely rewarding lawbreakers. For more than a decade, from the mid-1950s until the late 1960s, conservatives systematically and strategically linked opposition to civil rights legislation to calls for law and order, arguing that Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of civil disobedience was a leading cause of crime. Civil rights protests were frequently depicted as criminal rather than political in nature, and federal courts were accused of excessive lenience toward lawlessness, thereby contributing to the spread of crime. In the words of then Vice President Richard Nixon, the increasing crime rate can be traced directly to the spread of the corrosive doctrine that every citizen possesses an inherent right to decide for himself which laws to obey and when to disobey them. Some segregationists went further, insisting that integration causes crime, citing lower crime rates in Southern states as evidence that segregation was necessary. In the words of Representative John Bell Williams, this exodus of Negroes from the South, and their influx into the great metropolitan centers of other areas of the nation, has been accompanied by a wave of crime. What has civil rights accomplished for these areas? Segregation is the only answer, as most Americans, not the politicians, have realized for hundreds of years.
Katherine Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. We will return the segment, The Birth of Mass Incarceration, the chapter, unfortunately, at the same time that the civil rights were being identified as a threat. That's where we will resume. Buddy, I will tell you, I was all ready to roll for today's broadcast. Wi-Fi at the residence died literally like, I think, an hour before we were about to go live. It even took me some time to figure out, like, what is going on here and blah, blah, blah. It was so close to the live broadcast time. It's like, oh, we might have to even not do a broadcast today, but Lion Michelle Alexander was going to get it. Wi-Fi or no, electricity or no, hell, fire, brimstone. She is going to need a lot of miracles to keep Gus T off of the new Jim Crow. The number 720-716-7300. The code 564-943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. And even if it had been catastrophic weather or whatever the case may be, at worst I would have just said, well, we will do the book club on Sunday. It'll just be delayed by a day or two. It's like, man, I'm going to even do my best to make sure that we are not delayed so that we can get down normal day, normal time. Let's get to it. Number again, 720-716-7300. The code 564-943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. The email untiljustice@gmail.com. Shout to Bill Whitaker, privileged black male. He was so codified. He was doing that interview with Tom Coleman at 60 Minutes, and Tom Coleman, I say nigger all the time, and I fit in with the niggers, and I love niggers, and niggers are the best. Sup, nigger? My niggers for life. Bill Whitaker say, well, you call me a nigger? He said, oh, no, sir, I wouldn't call you a nigger. To your face. But no, sir, I wouldn't call you a nigger. Nigger. Shout to Bill Whitaker. He's cool. He didn't get mad. Bill Whitaker, what you say? I'll bop you. He just stay cool and just go. Next question. Bravo, Bill Whitaker. Let's see. I will share one email and then see if folks have thoughts, observations to share. The email again, untiljustice@gmail.com. Email number one. Let's see. Hi, Gus, Cow's audience. Number one, I learned Michelle Alexander had a white parent from earlier discussions on the cows. Gus T has been talking about this for years. We did a whole program, in fact. Why does it matter if a non-white person has a white parent? We did a whole program about that. I cited Michelle Alexander. I hadn't even read it. If you had told me then, it's going to take you another 10 years before you read her book. Like, wow. Although I would add, hey, Gus T thought from the beginning. I did not think this book was very impressive, so I was not in no hurry to read. I believe the white people who paid for her to write this book knew that fact beforehand also. White people, in my opinion, they are very smart about that. Old obesers, that ain't no accident. Like, what? Obama's white mama in Kansas? What? Really? Is that true? Nah, man. They are I'm the one ignorant. Wemby, basketball player, France. Wemby got a white mom? What? Is that true? They knew that years ago. Oh, yeah, he got a white. Oh, yeah. We, he got the white parent. Yeah, yes. They're not ignorant about racism. We are ignorant about racism, too. I was puzzled at the fact she had 3 children in 4 years and was able to write a book while they were so young, even with help. Now, I understand how. I am learning things I didn't know about. Yes, things that I will do more research on. However, it seems like the author is rushing through and cherry-picking bits of history and authors that support her narrative. Buddy, that is being out of this world generous. That's where you can call it cherry-picking and rushing through history. She is lying. when you conceal and omit pertinent information to your subject matter that you're aware of, and you deliberately omit this information to mislead your readers so that they'll be swayed to you are lying. That is textbook deception. Like I said, they have whole books written about deception where they make sure to include that willful omission, concealment of information. That is lying. And I have no reason to believe, and I mean no reason to believe. Matter of fact, we ain't even got to get to, we can just pedal this back. Why did we waste all that time reading the preface for the brand new version of the book? The preface for the 10th anniversary edition of the book. She had to waste time to lie, to tell us, look here now, I was out there speaking to half-empty audiences, and ain't nobody even heard of no Jim Crow when I was first out there. It was echo, echo, echo. Meanwhile, she's at Martha's Vineyard at a sold-out venue and on NPR every other week. Like, don't lie. That's what I'm saying. Like, that's being, I'm not disagreeing with the person who wrote it. I'm just saying we can be generous and say she's cherry-picking. No way. Gus T, Michelle Alexander is lying. Like every other page is lying, 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 lying. 3. White supremacy over time became a religion of sorts. Faith in the idea that people of the African race were bestial, that whites were inherently superior, and that slavery was, in fact, for blacks' own good, served to alleviate the white conscience and reconcile the tension between slavery and the democratic ideals espoused by whites in the so-called New World. Where is the evidence that white people have a conscience about racism? Facts. Facts. I was in agreement. I said religion of white supremacy. The only thing I said was, wait a minute, I don't see no tension. I don't see no white guilt where they feel bad and all the racist jokes. It seems white people enjoy practicing racism. Ain't no tension. If it was some tension, maybe they would have stopped doing all this after all these hundreds of years. We ain't seen no evidence of that at all. I don't see no. Matter of fact, I'm going to just keep pulling it back to the personal. So, did you see any sort of guilt? Your white family members booting your mom to the curb? Being grisly and racist with your black dad who's no longer with us? That probably contributed to him dying at an early age. Didn't even get to see this book be published. That probably was a contributing factor. Come on with all that colorblind and guilty. Like, come on. Might even call that more lies right there. 4. Kant's words, racial division was a consequence, not a precondition of slavery, but once it was instituted, it became detached from its initial function and acquired a social potency all its own. The people who were enslaved were black. How did that happen if the divide ideology did not exist before slavery was instituted? Excellent question. She had a number of different passages in that point where she's kind of rehashing her version of U.S. history, where I said, man, that is not the Bacon's Rebellion. I talked about that last week. I have to go over it in my notes where I was picking out. Are these lies? She's cherry picking. Whatever. It seems the concept of the white ally has been around for hundreds of years. That is no John Brown lie. White people really don't need to try hard to bamboozle black people. Facts. Facts. It is super duper easy. Maybe even has gotten easier as we continue to move forward. 2026. It's a myriad of people classified as white that, oh yeah, they can't be racist. You know, John Kennedy, John Brown, you know, tons of them. You just go down the list. Much obliged. That's email number 1. We'll nab the rest as we proceed. Let's see. *61 for folks who have commentary who dialed in, and then the email untiljustice@gmail.com. I will rewind and nab a few of my highlights just because it was such a bear to get on the air today, and then we'll nab folks who wrote in and the rest of our emails. Let's see, backing up to where we started off today. Death of slavery. Under slavery, the racial order was most effectively maintained by a large degree of contact between slave owners and slaves. Now, even that, shout to non-Clemson grad, our folks down in South Carolina, George Stingley. You have areas like South Carolina where there are very, very few white people, where the black people greatly outnumber the white people. So it can't be no whole lot of contact between black people and white people because it's just not a whole lot of white people. Ditto for places in the Caribbean, even though that's not what this book is about, but ditto the further south you go, if you move to the Caribbean where they have really high, Haiti, really massive volumes of black people in comparison to white people, it does not do anything to change the power dynamic at all. She continues, she says, minimizing potential for active resistance or rebellion, strict separation of the races would have threatened slaveholders' immediate interests and was in any event wholly unnecessary as a means of creating social distance or establishing the inferior status of slaves. You cannot have a system of white supremacy racism with so-called strict separation of the races. That is absolute nonsense. As a matter of fact, if we had so-called strict separation of the races, meaning white people never had direct contact with non-white people, we might be able to get this problem solved quickly. That's not what we have. And again, damn it, Massey, that's why I said, now she can say this old nonsense, lying Michelle Alexander, I bang my cowbell every time. She knows better than all of us. Ain't no separation between, look at your parents' bedroom. You wouldn't be here if we had separation between the so-called races. We wouldn't have this lame lying book. Separation between the races. If that were the case, everything would be like where she went to high school in Ashland, Oregon. All the race soldiers would be on their side of town and never would the two meet. That ain't what we got. And she knows this. Continuing. Although the convict laws enacted during this period are rarely seen as part of the black codes, that is a mistake. As explained by historian William Cohen, the main purpose of the codes was to control the freedmen, and the question of how to handle convicted black lawbreakers was very much at the center of the control issue. I don't know, when she says that the convict laws enacted during this period are rarely seen as a part of the black codes, I don't know who she's talking about. Maybe she's talking to us like we're idiots and such. Douglas Blackman was a guest on this program right at the same time when his book was published, as is Texas Tough. All of the authors who I have read who talk about the convict leasing system, they talk about this as a deliberate, not colorblind, as a deliberate white supremacist means of controlling black people. In fact, I couldn't name a person who does not talk about the convict leasing system as a deliberate means of white supremacy racism. This is a part. That's what Douglas Blackman's whole book is about, which is way better than this trash. Like, way better than this trash. I don't even know. She'd have to even put names on it. Who are you talking about that doesn't think of it this way as racism, deliberately so? She says, while the Reconstruction era was fraught with corruption, arguably doomed by the lack of land reform, the sweeping economic and political developments in that period did appear, for at least a time. I thought it was important. They have whole books about the Freedmen's Bank that was deliberately robbed and looted by white people. They have entire books about this at that time now. And about what happened during this time period, and white people having all of this money deliberately stolen by some of their white allies, some of the good white people, and then they tried to blame this on Frederick Douglass at the end after they had robbed and looted and stole everything so they can make it seem like it was his fault. Again, not colorblind. Let's see. She says racial segregation had actually been years earlier in the North as an effort to prevent race mixing and pressure racial hierarchy following the abolition of Northern slavery. It had never developed, however, into a comprehensive system, operating instead largely as a matter of custom enforced with varying degrees of consistency. Even among the most hostile to Reconstruction, few would have predicted that racial segregation would soon evolve into a new racial caste system as stunningly comprehensive and repressive as the one that came to be known simply as Jim Crow. All of this to me seems like just gobbledygook, nonsense. You're being mealy-mouthed. There was a system of white supremacy in place throughout this entire time. You have refinements, you have edits, but the idea that white people thought there was going to be some form of justice in the future, are you out of your biracial mind? Are you lying to us? Who thought that when you got, it's documented from that time period that you have white people in New York saying, hey, we're going to go fight for the Union. We are not for the Negroes. In fact, send them back to Africa. What do you mean we thought, anybody thought sometime in the future, like, oh man, it's going to be great. Well, ain't no way we're going to still have a system of white supremacy, racism. All of that, in my view, that's just a massive lie. You're a Stanford scholar. Like, what? And if you don't know all of this, put the pen down, close that laptop, and go back to Stanford, get a master's, get a PhD, shut up, and stop telling us all these lies and BS, trash, lying, half-racial, no name calling this, but I mean, woo, this is some high-level, high-grade nonsense and lies. We ain't even got to the meat of the text, even that. We're supposed to be talking about Jim Crow. If you were going to do a better job talking about Alexander and giving the history of all of this, wow, I'm impressed. Like when I read Douglas Blackman or Robert Perkinson's Texas Tough, maybe I'd feel differently. Since you did such a poor job, I don't need you going and giving your abbreviated nonsense version of U.S. history. Just get to the prison part. You can give me all this, but you can't include Attica. You can give me all this, but you can't include Jon Burge. That's why I say, man, this is not cherry picking. Where you choose to give me detail tells me, no, you're not cherry picking. You're lying. Why are you doing that? Lying, Michelle Alexander. Let's see. Folks who dialed in with a hand up. Caller who dialed in 5962 should be with us.
Yes, sir. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I think when we started the book, I said that I had purchased it in 2016 and read it, and I don't think I was screaming from the mountaintops to people to go ahead and read this book. However, I did think that I was at least learning something about racism, white supremacy, but in fact, I think I was just extremely confused, and this book, reading it the second time, is highlighting that I was just extremely confused about what I was reading. But from today's reading, the only part that really stuck out to me is in the part where it's talking about the death of Jim Crow. And she says that by 1945, a growing number of whites in the North had concluded that Jim Crow system would have to be modified, if not entirely overthrown. This conscience was due to a number of factors, including the increased political power of blacks due to the migration to the North and the growing membership and influence of the NAACP. Particularly its highly successful legal campaign challenging Jim Crow laws on federal courts. That seems to be in contrast to another book I've read on my free time, Mothers of Massive Resistance, where it just really talks about how white women who were interested in the political power, they basically were upset with the Democratic Party and left the Republican Party to take over what black people were in power, or so to speak, in power in politics in that area. So it doesn't seem like there was a growing black populace who was just taking over campaigns and challenging Jim Crow. And that's all I had at this time.
Much obliged for sharing, sir. When you read this book way back when, even though you acknowledge I wasn't out pasting billboards and telling people this is the greatest book ever, do you remember if you, because I think you said you purchased this book. You can set me straight if I'm wrong on that one, but do you remember if you purchased any other books on racism from that same year, if you can, or that same time period?
So no, I don't think I purchased anything from the same year. However, this was a follow-up book that I was reading to, I believe it's called Black Panther's Rage Against the Empire or Against the Machine or something of that nature. So this was the second book I purchased on, I thought, of racism, white supremacy. And so I was just following it up. But I bought it in 2016, and I'm going to have to go back and see what was going on at that time, because there was a huge display of this book in 2016 when I went into Barnes & Nobles, and I wasn't even in there for this book. But because there was such a big display, it caught my attention, and I ended up purchasing the book.
Even better context, much obliged. That book, Black Against Empire, The History and Politics of the Black Panther Party, published in 2013 by Joshua Bloom, Waldo Martin. That's so interesting because the Black Panther Party is totally excluded from this book, which I've not read, so we'll confirm as we go along. But unless I've been misinformed, they are totally excluded from this text. So that's fascinating that he jumped from Black Panther Party read to this book and was encouraged by the massive display in the bookstore. They didn't have a massive display for Neely Fuller Jr., medical apartheid, ISIS papers, Delectable Negro, which had been published at that point. No. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which had been out for 6 years by that point. That's what I mean. Like, wow, they got a vested interest. We're still even putting up big displays for this book 6 years later. Wow. Much obliged for sharing, sir. And even former COWS guest, Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae, the author of Mothers of Massive Resistance, White Women and the Politics of White Supremacy. I thought that book also more accurate than the one we are reading here. You can go back here in the archives. Let's see. I'll get in one more email. *61. Other folks have commentary to share. I'll sneak in one more email as we proceed until justice@gmail.com. Email number 2. Greetings, Gus, listeners, callers. The Death of Slavery, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, written by C. Van Woodard, 1955. Suspected racist American historian, he was considered a liberal early in his career and an advocate for civil rights. He was attacked by the New Left during the 1960s, and at the end of his career, he was considered conservative and right-leaning. He was against the so-called Black Power movements and affirmative action. Well, I don't want no jobs for white women either, so whatever. He publicly feuded with black historian John Hope Franklin and thought that Franklin, who was hired by Duke University using racial criteria, so Franklin was one of those lame DEI hires, just like when University of North Carolina tried to hire historian Nicole Hannah-Jones. Wait a minute. Cowbell. Are all white people racist? Again, the people who are experts regularly put forward, this is who you should listen to when you talk about racism. Nicole Hannah-Jones, Dorothy Roberts, Michelle Alexander, Melissa Harris Perry, President Obezers. Come on. 2. Racial segregation had actually begun years earlier in the North as an effort to prevent race mixing and preserve racial hierarchy following the abolition of Northern slavery. It had never developed, however, into a comprehensive system, operating instead largely as a matter of custom enforced with varying degrees of consistency. I'm not so sure about this. This may be an attempt at racial narrowing or minimizing racial terrorism in the so-called North. See C.O.W.S. Book Club, Sundown Towns. Absolutely, because he said, that's what I mean. You have a system of white supremacy, racism, and those sundown towns, he said they're mostly in the North. And even then, you can come in to work, clean up whatever we need done, pick cotton, whatever we need done, beat it. Don't think you're going to be staying here, nothing like that. Or if we want to roll around in the back seat or something, great. But we still going to practice racism. Come on, let's see. Birth of Jim Crow. Douglas Blackman, Slavery by Another Name, describes how tens of thousands of African Americans were arbitrarily arrested. Was he an author or guest on the C.O.W.S? Yes. 2. In 2010, that same year the book came out, I think, or very close to. 2. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution had abolished slavery but allowed one major exception. Slavery remained appropriate as punishment for crime. I had not looked at the 13th Amendment closely until reading this text the first time. Thus, this was constructive information for me. 3. Three alternative philosophies of race relation that phrase liberalism, conservatism, radicalism. The populist approach was preferable to the paternalism of liberalism. These terms have, I think, intentionally vague and varying definitions, absolutely, which causes a lot of confusion among victims. And you could be a racist and say, I'm a conservative, I'm a liberal, I'm a radical, and you still practice racism on all of those fronts. Tom Watson was a prominent populist leader. William Julius Wilson has noted populist principles could never be fully embraced by the South until blacks were eliminated from politics. Watson died in 1922, suspected racist politician, attorney, newspaper editor, and writer from Georgia. He condemned lynching. His views changed around 1900, allegedly, and he identified as a white supremacist. Maybe the author should have given more emphasis to his racist views. Are all white people racist? Question. William J. Williams, Ph.D., black male, 1935, sociologist, professor emeritus, Harvard University. His text, The Declining Significance of Race, published in 1980, garnered a lot of controversy and criticism. My impression is that a lot of suspected racists in academia think highly of this victim's scholarship. If it's a non-white person especially, and they minimize racism, Alex Kaufman, we just had him as a guest on the program. Oh yeah, great, bestseller. Let's promote that heavily. And with Tom Watson, I just wanted to point out, we've been here so long and done thorough work. I personally have talked about Tom Watson many times. I've cited that quote before, and I bring that up. I don't even reference him as a white ally or white person who is not racist. He could have been lying the whole time. I'm a politician. I'm just going to say whatever I need to get in office. And then, the populist fad is over. Oh, forget it. Yeah, I was with y'all the whole time. I was just saying that, just get them niggers votes, I say nigger more than everybody. See? Mav Seagrass, she was a guest on the program, I think in like 2011. That was the first time that I've learned about Tom Watson, and it's been shocking the number of times that his name pops up over the years as a so-called good, not racist white person. 5. By the turn of the 20th century, every state in the South had laws on the books that disenfranchised blacks and discriminated against them in virtually every sphere of life. The public symbols and constant reminders of black subjugation. The new racial order known as Jim Crow, a term apparently derived from a minstrel show character. The emphasis on racism, white supremacy as a Southern phenomenon may be an attempt at racial narrowing in this text. And I agree. I can only emphasize again, this non-white female with one white parent grew up in Klan territory of Oregon. 0.5% black people in her Klan territory of Oregon. She knows this ain't no Southern thing. It's ignorant. I've said that before we got to this book. It's ignorant. It's not accurate. It's not constructive to even think about white supremacy, racism. This is some Southern thing. No, man. Aren't we going to get to Chicago in this book? Oh, okay. So they do lock up black people in places beyond us. Okay. Got it. Total system of white supremacy, racism. That's what we're talking about. Shout to Khalid Browder. That's not in Mississippi. Let's see. Death of Jim Crow. The general public typically traces the death of Jim Crow to Brown v. Board of Education, although the institution was showing signs of weakness for years. I don't think black people marked the death of Jim Crow by Brown v. Board of Education, particularly with all the white terrorism coming after it. facts. That's why I said she makes a number of flagrant statements like that in this book. Last week when she said that most people in America had disavowed racism. Pause. Just because you grew up with a white woman in your hand, in fact, double pause. You know this isn't true because your white family didn't even accept your black dad. That's why I said I can only conclude, lying Michelle Alexander, you are deliberately deceiving us. To sit up and say some nonsense like most people, the general public, who are you talking about? Brown v. Matter of fact, pause for Gus T research. I know I'm not saying no Jim Crow ended with Brown v. Board of Education decision when you got the FBI snooping on Dr. Welsing when she's 19 years old in 1954. Get out of here. Emmett Till is killed, lynched the next year. That's the end of Jim Crow. What are you talking about? At minimum, you sound like you went through the diploma mill to get that Stanford degree. At minimum, you didn't earn it. DEI acceptance, DEI hire, and all the people who read this book and claim it's great, it's awesome, best thing ever. Birth of mass incarceration. Oh, we didn't get that far. We'll have to pause and get back. Oh, wait a minute. I'll make sure I get the rest. At the time of the publication of this text, the schools were just as segregated or more in the 1950s. Moreover, one of the attorneys on the case for the NAACP, Derek Bell, thought the decision was a failure in terms of its effect on the system of racism, white supremacy. Senator Irwin was heralded during the 1970s due to the televised Watergate hearings. No mention of this history of racism was mentioned at the time, or at most downplayed. Whenever you bring up their history of racism, they say, he has changed. Including the phrase, Negroes in the sun, struck me as a little derogatory and unnecessary. Facts, the whole chapter seemed superficial and full of inaccuracies by omission. Again, I can only say, in my view, we could call this cherry picking. We could call these inaccuracies. In my view, it is most correct, based on logic, these are lies, period. And I'm saying specifically they are lies because I'm saying this is not because Michelle Alexander was ignorant about all this extra information. That's what I'm submitting. I'm submitting she was not a DEI acceptance into Stanford, that she was well educated in Oregon, well educated at Stanford, and that she knows this information. She just chose willfully to lie to her readers 2 times because she could have cleaned this up in the edition, 10th anniversary edition. That's what I'm submitting, arrogantly so. And I'm side-eyeing all of the listeners, readers, who read this trash and thought, oh man, this is great. That again, I'm saying all of the acclaim that this book got, you award race soldiers, we heard it. They put displays up for 10 years. Best book ever. Best book ever. Best book ever. They can hype anything. They can hype trash. And we are Team Limp Noodle. It's easy to trick black people. It's easy to trick people who are not informed. That's us, Gus T included. We'll pause there. Didn't get the rest of it. Let's see. Did I have more notes? Did I get to finish my notes even? Birth of Jim Crow. In an effort to demonstrate their commitment to a genuinely multiracial working class movement against white elites, the populace. I talked about all of this. And again, this is the type of thing that I remember when people say we need multiracial effort. We got to have white people involved. We've seen all of that. White people who can come, I'm against racism for 30 seconds or a day, or, ooh, this is hard. I done changed my mind. Or, wink, wink, I'm against racism. Testing. Is the microphone on? Okay, yes. Go ahead. I'm against racism too. Like, come on, man. Be logical. Let's see. And this whole narrative that poor white people, that they were just ignorant dupes, I reject all of that. She said that last week, that, hey, poor white people and black people, we didn't really have a fully formed system of racism. in the 1600s and 1700s in colonial North America. And so they had the planter class, the really powerful white people, slave owners. They had to pull in all these laws and such. Hey, man, I told you, we talked about this. With Jacqueline Badalora. She was at the White Privilege Conference in 2010. That's the year this book was published. I don't remember everybody being goofy about this book there, but I might just not be in my memory banks. It was published by the time we were there in spring. It was April 2010. But Jacqueline Badalora was there, and she talked about this consistently, how the normal telling is poor white people and black people were working it together and going to do justice, and the powerful white people came together and said, oh, we got to do something about this. And she says, wrong. You got historical evidence. You already had a firmly entrenched system. Poor white people and Negroes are not the same. Evidence, you already had almost 50 years before Bacon's Rebellion. They had laws on the book that black people, and particularly Negro slaves, you can't even own a firearm. They didn't have any law like that for poor white people. That is in the land of Second Amendment. From my cold, dead hand, that is a massive distinction between who is a man and who is a Negro in the colonies, way before we get to some Bacon's Rebellion, and who can have sexual activity with a white person. But we ain't got to give it that. We got enough cowbell already in this book, and you can go back and hear Jacqueline Badalora to get to all that. But that's another lie. Now, she can say, hey, I didn't know about Jacqueline Badalora's scholarship. Okay, lame Gus T knew about it, and I didn't go to Stanford. Let's see. When she says during World War II, there was an increased concern that without greater, this is in The Death of Jim Crow, that if there was without greater equality for African Americans, blacks would become susceptible to communist influence. That is the biggest lie. Like, are you serious? J. Edgar Hoover. Matter of fact, what I just say? They peeping and snooping on Dr. Matter of fact, what did we just hear from Dr. Kenneth O'Reilly days before? We gonna recruit black people for COINTELPRO so they can be communists, because if you say that Negro is a fink, he came here to spy on us, you're racist. You're racist. I'm not a spy. You're racist. You're just being a racist. You're trying to tar me. Didn't Dr. O'Reilly, he just told us that 3 days ago. Context, talking about FBI snooping on Dr. Welsing. That's why I said this book, that's another lie. Now, unless you're telling me Michelle Alexander is such a lame brain, lump gump, retard, no count scholar that never heard of COINTELPRO, or she knew about it and didn't know the context, how it relates to this book, unless that's what you're telling me, then I say, oh, okay, she's just a retarded scholar. Okay. I don't normally cheer and celebrate retard scholars. I say I'm retarded. I'm still learning. What I say, worthless Negro from Virginia. That's what I say. I don't go and put big billboards up for somebody that is an ignorant, no count dullard. You didn't do your homework. You don't know history correctly. I don't go and promote and celebrate them as saying they wrote the best book ever. I just, they need to get their act together. Go back to school. Go back to Palo Alto. Correspondence class, man. Get with Mark Furman. Get a GED. Let's see. And all the people who read this book the first time around and said, this is amazing. This is the best book I ever read. This book, we just started it. It was 6th on my list of worst books ever. It's moved up to 4. We're still in chapter 1. Let's see. How much time we got? Man, we could have missed this session today, man. We could have missed this session today because I didn't have no Wi-Fi. I said, oh, no. You are going to get all. I put my brass knuckles on. I'm on her ass every week. And all of you who read this book, Team Limp Noodle, man, that's what y'all going to hear until we get to the end of this book. I told you before I opened a page, just looking at the cover and title for this trash. When she get to talking about John F. Kennedy, this is where I can only say, Michelle Alexander, you're a liar. You came out and deliberately lied. Are you going to tell me that John F. Kennedy is a good white man? You lying mulatto half. Oh. And that's what we've been talking about for the whole month. That's what we've been talking about for the whole month. How many people going to come on the program Dr. O'Reilly, James D. Eugenio gonna come on the program and got to, hey, Gus T, now you know John Fox Kennedy. You know that's a good white man. You know he loved the Negro. You know he put that civil rights bill out there for the Negro. Man, you're not going to talk to me. You can talk to the rest of, I know we are Team Limp Noodle. Gus T. Renegade, top of the list. That's true. Retarded, pitiful, primitive, worthy of great pity. That's what Mr. Fuller said. That's true. For Gus T., you put my name at the top of the list. But March on Washington, Michelle Alexander, you are lying massively. You're not going to talk to me like I'm a retard on this one. I read. The rest of you all, you don't read. You watch TV. I got it. Malcolm X alone excoriated this. You're going to talk to me like he didn't even say that? Like we didn't read this? Like he didn't call him a fox? Matter of fact, you're going to talk to me like I don't know the history of the March on Washington. Michael Thelwell was a guest on this program. Castrated giant talking about the March on Washington. He was a member of SNCC. He did not say the March on Washington was the peak of the so-called civil rights movement. He said, I couldn't even hear the speeches. The late John Lewis did not say the March on Washington was the peak of the civil rights movement. He said, they muted me. They wouldn't even let me. We're supposed to have freedom of speech. Constitution. They wouldn't even let me say what I wanted to say at the speech because I was going to be critical of that white man in the White House. You can go read the newspaper on some. That's why I said, Michelle Alexander, you lied. It's like every paragraph. You just lied and lied and lied and lied and lied. And then let me get a few more lies on in there. John Kennedy did not plan the March on Washington. Black people did. Their goal was not no lame, gay civil rights bill. That was not the goal at all. It was to force white people in the federal government enforce the Constitution and protect it. She even lies. She's a liar every paragraph. Like I said, we're Team Limp Noodle, and we don't do no reading. We sit around and watch Netflix, read The Hate You Give, so we don't know nothing. For her to even come out and put on paper, Kennedy sent federal troops into the South. Yes, he did. They did not protect no black people, and they got video footage of black people and even some of the lame white allies they want to talk about being savaged and pummeled by lame white federal officials, spectated, took notes. That was the tone. Really, that was why. You can go back and hear all this. James Meredith, you can go back and hear all this for 1960. That's just what we talked about. That's why I wanted James to you. That's why I emailed Dr. O'Reilly at the beginning of the month. John Kennedy is not no ally to Negroes. That was why I wanted him on the program, but I second-guessed myself. I said, oh, man, that's not important. We're talking about some lame white man who's been dead for 60 years. It's got to be more current things to discuss. I didn't know lame, lying Michelle Alexander was going to walk me to this anyway. Maybe it is important if we're going to keep having to get John Brown and John Kennedy and Jane Elliott and all these lame white people are not racist. Maybe we should have had them on to talk about that. Especially Team Limp Noodle. We're not going to do no research, most of us. You don't know nothing about this era, so they can just come and make up lies. John Kennedy was the champion of and again, unless you're going to tell me Michelle Alexander, she is retarded, Gus T. She was on the short bus, Gus T. She should have got a GED, Gus T. Unless that's what you're telling me, okay, my bad. If that's the case, this punk-ass book should have never been promoted. Put her back on the small bus, say she's retarded, and, well, okay, we'll give her a pass. We'll give her some grace. That's not what you said. Y'all said, this greatest author ever. She got a Stanford degree, Gus T. That's Dr. William Shockley. Palo Alto, man. She's supposed to be smart. So you're telling me she knew about COINTELPRO. She didn't connect it to this book. Even when we get to the March on Washington, heavily infiltrated. That's right in the middle of JFK. She ain't say nothing about that. You don't see no relevance. You even talk about white citizens councils. I don't want to hear no bullshit about private citizens when you got the state government at a federal level. They're spying on Dr. Welsing, and you don't think that's relevant? Now, again, if she's retarded and she doesn't know any of this, just say that. We don't need to read retarded people's books. If she's retarded, say that. She's retarded. I'm saying Michelle Alexander is not retarded. This is lying. You're going to tell me you smart enough to know about the Citizens Council. You don't know about the FBI doing all this snooping? And or You're not intelligent enough to connect that to the prison population. Even when we get to Johnson, don't you tell me about no social programs and I'm investing and I'm a friend of the Negro. Wrong. COINTELPRO again. I could stop right there. I'm not. We just had this discussion with a white author days ago. She tried to do the same thing. Not all white people is racist, Gus T. I said, for real, Stacey Horn, I don't even believe you can say you are not a racist. Facts. Now let's get back to Johnson. Are you telling me LBJ is not a racist? Stacey Horn admitted racist? Whoa, 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 Gus T. Whoa, 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 Gus T. With her, I didn't pull COINTELPRO. With her, I pulled the V word. Vietnam. I didn't hear Vietnam pop up here at all. She had the audacity. You half-breed lion mulatto, you gonna come out here and tell me Dr. King got killed because of his Poor People's Campaign? I done told y'all, John Patash, multiple time guest on this program. He wrote the FBI's war, the FBI's war, the FBI's war against Tupac Shakur and black leaders. He said, what date was Dr. King killed on? April 4. Why is that important? Wow, he gave a speech the year before. He wasn't talking about no punk-ass poor white people. He was talking about Vietnam. That's related right there. You want to talk about military-industrial complex and black people ended up in prison? Vietnam. Golden Triangle and all that heroin. War on drugs. Vietnam. Where is that at? Does LBJ get some blame for that? Maybe he wasn't so cool. He could have stopped all that Muhammad Ali could have kept his championship and we wouldn't have had all that heroin. Maybe we don't even have a war on drugs. Beat it, man. Michelle Alexander is out of this world lame, out of this world liar. Again, this gets over. We are team limp noodle. I cannot say this enough. You can totally exploit, fool, really clown black people because we don't read and brag about not reading, boast about not reading. It's white people to blame, but woo, that is a massive part. And again, I humbly, well, it ain't even humble. I'm so appalled about it. If Michelle Alexander had two black parents, I humbly submit, you would have heard a whole lot less about this trash book. Facts. I'll take some of the base out, my boy, since that's one I can't really prove per se, but woo, give me the exact same trash book, exact same trash cover, exact same trash title, exact same lies from beginning to end, just she got two black parents. It's going to be a lot less hoopla about this lame book. Facts. Let's see if anybody else got comments they need to share before we get to audio segment number 2. Let's see. One more email, and then we finish. So we have at least 3 at this point, so we've read 1.5. We'll be sure to catch the other half of our email on the other side of the audio segment. I didn't see any other hands at this point. Making sure. Any other hands? Okay. If you have additional commentary, write your thoughts down, and we will return to easily one of the lamest books I have ever read in my life. Easily. And it's offensive. It is offensive. And even people who talked about this is one of the first books that they read to reach out and learn more about racism. It reminded me, Dr. Cambon and many others, they talked about in racism, the battle. It is a race to the brain computer, to your mind. The way that you think about white supremacy, racism, and what it means to be classified as white, which basically is the same thing, it can be drastically altered forever if you are a non-white person and one of the first books you read about racism is this, as opposed to the first book you read about racism, ISIS Papers, Delectable Negro, Code Book, Man Not, Urugu. Very different framework for how you think about this problem, how you think about what it means to be classified as white. You start with because you start with a book like this, now you're going to have to go back and unlearn a whole, you might have to go and relearn, retrain your brain computer, get away all that class and poor white people and all of that, and then go back and reassess this book. Like something like, man, I read this the first time and I thought, and I didn't even know she had a white parent. And then, oh, man, whole lot of people, they're not going to get that, especially, you got TV, what's coming on TV? Oh, man, Bron James playing. Oh, man, we're going to read that tomorrow. We get that tomorrow. Maybe they're going to have Game 7. We'll read that next week. We get that next month. We get that. Man, come on. Audio segment 2, Katherine Massey Book Club, 4th worst book ever. And it might move higher by the time we get to the end. New Jim Crow. Oh, even the title is lame. Michelle Alexander, Cal Bell, Context of White Supremacy.
Unfortunately, at the same time that civil rights were being identified as a threat to law and order, the FBI was reporting fairly dramatic increases in the national crime rate. Despite significant controversy over the accuracy of the statistics, these reports received a great deal of publicity and were offered as further evidence of the breakdown in lawfulness, morality, and social stability. To make matters worse, riots erupted in the summer of 1964 in Harlem and Rochester, followed by a series of uprisings that swept the nation following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The racial imagery associated with the riots gave fuel to the argument that civil rights for blacks led to rampant crime. Cities like Philadelphia and Rochester were described as being victims of their own generosity. Conservatives argued that, having welcomed blacks migrating from the South, these cities were repaid with crime-ridden slums and black discontent. Barry Goldwater, in his 1964 presidential campaign, aggressively exploited the riots and fears of black crime, laying the foundation for the Get Tough on Crime movement that would emerge years later. In a widely quoted speech, Goldwater warned voters, "Choose the way of the Johnson administration and you have the way of mobs in the street." Civil rights activists who argued that the uprisings were directly related to widespread police harassment and abuse were dismissed by conservatives out of hand. If blacks conduct themselves in an orderly way, they will not have to worry about police brutality, argued West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd. Early on, little effort was made to disguise the racial motivations behind the law and order rhetoric and the harsh criminal justice legislation proposed in Congress. The most ardent opponents of civil rights legislation and desegregation were the most active on the emerging crime issue. Well-known segregationist George Wallace, for example, argued that the same Supreme Court that ordered integration and encouraged civil rights legislation was now bending over backwards to help criminals. 3 other prominent segregationists, Senators McClellan, Irwin, and Thurmond, led the legislative battle to curb the rights of criminal defendants. As the rules of acceptable discourse changed, however, segregationists distanced themselves from an explicitly racist agenda. They developed instead the racially sanitized rhetoric of cracking down on crime, rhetoric that is now used freely by politicians of every stripe. Conservative politicians who embraced this rhetoric purposefully failed to distinguish between the direct action tactics of civil rights activists, violent rebellions in inner cities, and traditional crimes of an economic or violent nature. Instead, as Mark Maurer of the Sentencing Project has noted, all of these phenomena were subsumed under the heading of crime in the streets. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the public debate shifted focus from segregation to crime. The battle lines, however, remained largely the same. Positions taken on crime policies typically cohered along lines of racial ideology. Political scientist Bessel Weaver explains, votes cast in opposition to open housing, busing, the Civil Rights Act, and other measures time and again showed the same divisions as votes for amendments to crime bills. Members of Congress who voted against civil rights measures proactively designed crime legislation and actively fought for their proposals. Although law and order rhetoric ultimately failed to prevent the formal dismantling of the Jim Crow system, it proved highly effective in appealing to poor and working-class whites, particularly in the South, who were opposed to integration and frustrated by the Democratic Party's apparent support for the civil rights movement. As Weaver notes, rather than fading, the segregationists' crime-race argument was reframed, with a slightly different veneer, and eventually became the foundation of the conservative agenda on crime. In fact, law and order rhetoric, first employed by segregationists, would eventually contribute to a major realignment of political parties in the United States. Following the Civil War, party alignment was almost entirely regional. The South was solidly Democratic, embittered by the war, firmly committed to the maintenance of a racial caste system, and extremely hostile to federal intervention on behalf of African Americans. The North was overwhelming Republican and, while Republicans were ambivalent about equality for African Americans, they were far more inclined to adopt and implement racial justice reforms than their Democratic counterparts below the Mason-Dixon line. The Great Depression effectuated a sea change in American race relations and party alignment. The New Deal, spearheaded by the Democratic Party of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was designed to alleviate the suffering of poor people in the midst of the Depression, and blacks, the poorest of the poor, benefited disproportionately. While New Deal programs were rife with discrimination in their administration, they at least included blacks within the pool of beneficiaries, a development, historian Michael Klarman has noted, that was sufficient to raise black hopes and expectations after decades of malign neglect from Washington. Poor and working-class whites in both the North and South, no less than African Americans, responded positively to the New Deal, anxious for meaningful economic relief. As a result, the Democratic New Deal coalition evolved into an alliance of urban ethnic groups and the white South that dominated electoral politics from 1932 to the early 1960s. That dominance came to an abrupt end with the creation and implementation of what has come to be known as the Southern Strategy. The success of law and order rhetoric among working-class whites and the intense resentment of racial reforms, particularly in the South, led conservative Republican analysts to believe that a new majority could be created by the Republican Party, one that included the traditional Republican base, the white South, and half the Catholic, blue-collar vote of the big cities. Some conservative political strategists admitted that appealing to racial fears and antagonisms was central to this strategy, though it had to be done surreptitiously. H.R. Haldeman, one of Nixon's key advisers, recalls that Nixon himself deliberately pursued a Southern, racial strategy. He, President Nixon, emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. Similarly, John Ehrlichman, special counsel to the president, explained the Nixon administration's campaign strategy of 1968 in this way: "We'll go after the racists." In Ehrlichman's view, that subliminal appeal to the anti-black voter was always present in Nixon's statements and speeches. Republican strategist Kevin Phillips is often credited for offering the most influential argument in favor of a race-based strategy for Republican political dominance in the South. He argued in The Emerging Republican Majority, published in 1969, that Nixon's successful presidential election campaign could point the way toward long-term political realignment and the building of a new Republican majority, if Republicans continued to campaign primarily on the basis of racial issues, using coded anti-black rhetoric. He argued that Southern white Democrats had become so angered and alienated by the Democratic Party's support for civil rights reforms, such as desegregation and busing, that those voters could be easily persuaded to switch parties if those racial resentments could be maintained. Warren Weaver, a New York Times journalist who reviewed the book upon its release, observed that Phillips's strategy largely depended upon creating and maintaining a racially polarized political environment. Full racial polarization is an essential ingredient of Phillips' political pragmatism. He wants to see a black Democratic Party, particularly in the South, because this will drive into the Republican Party precisely the kind of anti-Negro whites who will help constitute the emerging majority. This even leads him to support some civil rights efforts. Appealing to the racism and vulnerability of working-class whites had worked to defeat the populists at the turn of the century, and a growing number of conservatives believed the tactic should be employed again, albeit in a more subtle fashion. Thus in the late 1960s and early 1970s, two schools of thought were offered to the general public regarding race, poverty, and the social order. Conservatives argued that poverty was caused not by structural factors related to race and class but rather by culture, particularly black culture. This view received support from Daniel Patrick Moynihan's now infamous report on the Black Family, which attributed black poverty to a black subculture and the tangle of pathology that characterized it. As described by sociologist Katherine, the alleged misbehaviors of the poor were transformed from adaptations to poverty that had the unfortunate effect of reproducing it into character failings that accounted for poverty in the first place. The social pathologies of the poor, particularly street crime, illegal drug use, and delinquency, were redefined by conservatives as having their cause in overly generous relief arrangements. Black welfare cheats and their dangerous offspring emerged, for the first time, in the political discourse and media imagery. Liberals, by contrast, insisted that social reforms such as the War on Poverty and civil rights legislation would get at the root causes of criminal behavior and stressed the social conditions that predictably generate crime. Lyndon Johnson, for example, argued during his 1964 presidential campaign against Barry Goldwater that anti-poverty programs were, in effect, anti-crime programs. There is something mighty wrong when a candidate for the highest office bemoans violence in the streets but votes against the war on poverty, votes against the Civil Rights Act and votes against major educational bills that come before him as a legislator. Competing images of the poor as deserving and undeserving became central components of the debate. Ultimately, the racialized nature of this imagery became a crucial resource for conservatives, who succeeded in using law and order rhetoric in their effort to mobilize the resentment of white working-class voters, many of whom felt threatened by the sudden progress of African Americans. As explained by Thomas and Mary Edsel in their insightful book Chain Reaction, a disproportionate share of the costs of integration and racial equality had been borne by lower and lower middle-class whites, who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms with blacks for jobs and status and who lived in neighborhoods adjoining black ghettos. Their children, not the children of wealthy whites, attended schools most likely to fall under busing orders. The affluent white liberals who were pressing the legal claims of blacks and other minorities were often sheltered, in their private lives, and largely immune to the costs of implementing minority claims. This reality made it possible for conservatives to characterize the liberal democratic establishment as being out of touch with ordinary working people, thus resolving one of the central problems facing conservatives: how to persuade poor and working-class voters to join an alliance with corporate interests and the conservative elite. By 1968, 81% of those responding to the Gallup poll agreed with the statement that law and order has broken down in this country, and the majority blamed Negroes who start riots and communists. During the presidential election that year, both the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, and the independent segregationist candidate, George Wallace, made law and order a central theme of their campaigns, and together they collected 57% of the vote. Nixon dedicated 17 speeches solely to the topic of law and order, and one of his television ads explicitly called on voters to reject the lawlessness of civil rights activists and embrace order in the United States. The advertisement began with frightening music accompanied by flashing images of protesters, bloodied victims, and violence. A deep voice then said, "It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change, but in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States." At the end of the ad, a caption declared, "This time. Vote like your whole world depended on it." Nixon. Viewing his own campaign ad, Nixon reportedly remarked with glee that the ad hits it right on the nose. "It's all about those damn Negro Puerto Rican groups out there." Race had become, yet again, a powerful wedge, breaking up what had been a solid liberal coalition based on economic interests of the poor and the working and lower middle classes. In the 1968 election, race eclipsed class as the organizing principle of American politics, and by 1972, attitudes on racial issues rather than socioeconomic status were the primary determinant of voters' political self-identification. The late 1960s and early 1970s marked the dramatic erosion in the belief among working-class whites that the condition of the poor, or those who failed to prosper, was the result of a faulty economic system that needed to be challenged. As the Edsels explain, the pitting of whites and blacks at the low end of the income distribution against each other intensified the view among many whites that the condition of life for the disadvantaged, particularly for disadvantaged blacks, is the responsibility of those afflicted, and not the responsibility of the larger society. 62. Just as race had been used at the turn of the century by Southern elites to rupture class solidarity at the bottom of the income ladder, race as a national issue had broken up the Democratic New Deal bottom-up coalition, a coalition dependent on substantial support from all voters, white and black, at or below the median income. The conservative revolution that took root within the Republican Party in the 1960s did not reach its full development until the election of 1980. The decade preceding Ronald Reagan's ascent to the presidency was characterized by political and social crises, as the civil rights movement was promptly followed by intense controversy over the implementation of the equality principle, especially busing and affirmative action, as well as dramatic political clashes over the Vietnam War and Watergate. During this period, conservatives gave lip service to the goal of racial equality but actively resisted desegregation, busing, and civil rights enforcement. They repeatedly raised the issue of welfare, subtly framing it as a contest between hard-working, blue-collar whites and poor blacks who refused to work. The not-so-subtle message to working-class whites was that their tax dollars were going to support special programs for blacks who most certainly did not deserve them. During this period, Nixon called for a war on drugs, an announcement that proved largely rhetorical as he declared illegal drugs public enemy number one without proposing dramatic shifts in drug policy. A backlash against blacks was clearly in force, but no consensus had yet been reached regarding what racial and social order would ultimately emerge from these turbulent times. In his campaign for the presidency, Reagan mastered the excision of the language of race from conservative public discourse and thus built on the success of earlier conservatives who developed a strategy of exploiting racial hostility or resentment for political gain without making explicit reference to race. Condemning welfare queens and criminal predators, he rode into office with the strong support of disaffected whites, poor and working-class whites who felt betrayed by the Democratic Party's embrace of the civil rights agenda. As one political insider explained, Reagan's appeal derived primarily from the ideological fervor of the right wing of the Republican Party and the emotional distress of those who fear or resent the Negro, and who expect Reagan somehow to keep him in his place or at least echo their own anger and frustration. To great effect, Reagan echoed white frustration in race-neutral terms through implicit racial appeals. His colorblind rhetoric on crime, welfare, taxes, and states' rights was clearly understood by white and black voters as having a racial dimension, though claims to that effect were impossible to prove. The absence of explicitly racist rhetoric afforded the racial nature of his coded appeals a certain plausible deniability. For example, when Reagan kicked off his presidential campaign at the annual Neshoba County Fair near Philadelphia, Mississippi, the town where 3 civil rights activists were murdered in 1964, he assured the crowd, "I believe in states' rights," and promised to restore to states and local governments the power that properly belonged to them. His critics promptly alleged that he was signaling a racial message to his audience, suggesting allegiance with those who resisted desegregation, but Reagan firmly denied it, forcing liberals into a position that would soon become familiar, arguing that something is racist but finding it impossible to prove in the absence of explicitly racist language. Crime and welfare were the major themes of Reagan's campaign rhetoric. According to the Edsels, one of Reagan's favorite and most often repeated anecdotes was the story of a Chicago welfare queen with 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards, whose tax-free income alone is over $150,000. The term welfare queen became a not-so-subtle code for lazy, greedy, black ghetto mother. The food stamp program, in turn, was a vehicle to let some fellow ahead of you buy a T-bone steak, while you were standing in a checkout line with your package of hamburger. These highly racialized appeals, targeted to poor and working-class whites, were nearly always accompanied by vehement promises to be tougher on crime and to enhance the federal government's role in combating it. Reagan portrayed the criminal as a staring face, a face that belongs to a frightening reality of our time, the face of the human predator. Reagan's racially coded rhetoric and strategy proved extraordinarily effective, as 22% of all Democrats defected from the party to vote for Reagan. The defection rate shot up to 34% among those Democrats who believed civil rights leaders were pushing too fast.
And we will pause there. I would have probably tried to get us to the end of the chapter if possible, but we will pick it up there next Friday It's a challenging Friday. Usual suspects to blame. The number to dial 720-716-7300. The code 564943#. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. The email untiljustice@gmail.com. Do not wait till the last moment if you think you have extra thought observation to share on the text. Let me see. I'll go back and finish up email number 2. Make sure we get all of our emails in for the day. Let's see. The remainder, our second email. Okay. Birth of mass incarceration. West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd, segregationist George Wallace, Senators McClellan, Irwin, and Thurman. Public debate shifted from segregation to crime. Some of these suspected racists allegedly eventually apologized and rejected their so-called racist past. Ho hum. I am not impressed. See the evolution of Robert Byrd's racial politics. David A. Love, The Degree of How a Failed Assassination Attempt pushed George Wallace to reconsider his segregationist views by Diane Beard. C.O.W.S. Book Club, Dear Senator, a memoir by the daughter of Strom Thurmond. I'm so glad we read that one in the book club. I will say they have video of George Wallace saying, oh man, I'm definitely not a racist. I used to give textbooks to the black people so that they could go to school, and we would have drives and things to make sure that the black children would have all the resources so that they could go to school. And he said, matter of fact, my best friend is a black person. Look at, and his black friend happened to be there. He said, come here, Leroy, come here. Let the folks see your pretty face. This is my best friend right here, Leroy. I couldn't go anywhere without Leroy now. Leroy didn't run in his fine Armani suit and looking good and polished, and I've been eating good and healthy and well compensated. Leroy just came on and looked right privileged, and I better not say too much. I'm just going, I don't want to get in trouble. And then he went on and sat back down like, come on. Anyway, don't get me started on old child raping Strom Thurmond. That's another time. 2. The New Deal, spearheaded by Democratic Party President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was designed to alleviate the suffering of poor people in the midst of the Depression. And blacks, the poorest of the poor, benefited disproportionately. They at least included blacks within the pool of beneficiaries. This is not accurate. The 1935 Social Security Act excluded agricultural and domestic workers as a way of excluding black people. C, left out the policy diffusion and the exclusion of black workers from unemployment insurance. Richard Rodham's H. Luke Schaefer. Now, when I read this, I said, well, I guess on one hand, she does say that there was lots of so-called discrimination within the program. But on the other hand, I was thinking, I've never heard anyone discuss the New Deal package and its implementation as anything other than racist for black people, and how they missed out on how so many of the policies were deliberately designed to make sure that they did not include black people, certainly not in the same way as even the poorest of the poor white people were taken care of in this program. That's always the way that I've heard it. And I mean, again, why is that the pattern where it's consistently you give a telling that is most welcoming and most favorable to racist? Oh, that's right, you got a white parent. In addition to who paid for you to do this project and all the rest of it. But it's just like, man, that alone, like, well, now again, if you don't know the history of all that, that's things from 100 years ago. This is your first time hearing about all of that. Okay, but I mean, man. 3. Haldeman, Nixon's key advisor, recalls that Nixon himself deliberately pursued a Southern racial strategy, emphasizing the whole problem is really the blacks, devise a system that recognized this while not appearing to. Ehrlichman, counsel to the President Nixon campaign strategy in 1968, will go after the racists In Ehrlichman's view, the subliminal appeal to the anti-black voter, Republican strategist Kevin Phillips is often credited for offering race-based strategy for the Republican dominance in the South. The way this section reads to me as if the author is implying that all these maneuvers were simply strategy as opposed to saying simply that Nixon and all his henchmen were just a bunch of racists practicing racism, white supremacy. Facts. Phillips, one of the architects of the so-called Southern strategy, rejected the Republican Party later in his career due to its role in causing wealth inequality and the alliance with Christian radicals, but there is no evidence that he rejected the racism, white supremacy. That would be important too. 4. The conservatives argued that poverty was caused not by structural factors related to race and class, but rather by culture, particularly Negro culture. This view received support from Daniel Patrick Moynihan's now famous report of the black family, which attributed black poverty to a black subculture. Moynihan, suspected racist, was a member of the Democratic Party who was a part of the President Kennedy and Johnson administrations in addition to being an advisor to Nixon. He became a U.S. Senator from New York. I think this may be important information demonstrating the Neely Fuller Jr. principle that racists take both sides of any argument, including Democrat, Republican, thus rendering irrelevant distinctions that the author is making between Democrats, Republicans, what about liberals, radicals, progressives, conservative. Like, she got a whole bunch of just more and more. We got different poor white people. We got all the different classes of white people. Get out of here, man. What class is your mom in? Lying, Michelle. 5. Thomas and Mary Edsall, in their insightful book Chain Reaction, a disproportionate share of the costs of integration and racial equality, so-called, have been borne by lower and lower middle class whites. See? I don't even know what that all means. Lower middle class whites. WTF, man. Is that a Stanford term? Who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms with blacks for jobs and status, who lived in neighborhoods adjoining black ghettos. Their children, not the children of wealthy whites, attended schools most likely to fall under busing orders. The affluent white liberals who were pressing the legal claims of blacks and other minorities were often sheltered in their private lives. This section seems to be a not-so-subtle attempt to frame the largest segment of the U.S. white population as victims, as opposed to being just a bunch of racists, white supremacists. So, if they did not have these economic issues, they would stop practicing racism? I don't think so. I agree wholeheartedly. It almost makes it seem like, oh man, these white people were doing well and enjoying their little, itty-bitty crumbs that they got, and now these niggers came into their area. I'm even pausing for a minute. So these white people, whatever status they had, was because you all were terrorizing black people. And once the terrorism stopped, and the metaphor they used, when the rules started being made just so that everyone had equal access, whoa, now we can't even compete. Like, whoa, the niggers is catching up. Like, that is really embarrassing. The only way that you can even do better and say we better than the niggers who are inferior is we got to have all kinds of laws, and where we cheat them at the bank and we cheat them at the post office and won't give them no job, and then all this racism. That's the only, yeah, we better. Once that ain't there, oh my Lord, they didn't ruin our whole, what is it? Vote like your world depends on it. White genetic annihilation. That's vote like your world depends on it. See? Number 6, Nixon called for a war on drugs, an announcement that proved largely rhetorical as he declared illegal drugs public enemy number 1 without proposing dramatic shifts in drug policy. It is documented that Nixon's so-called war on drugs was intentionally a war on black people. Oh, yep. Remember that. I think John Potash, yep, and he even got John Potash, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. So you got both his books. Whoopee for Mr. Potash, white man. We'll pause there so we didn't get to the conclusion of chapter 1, but we will next week. Let's see. And boom, we will next week have the full audio, presumably, unless white people cut a fool again, We'll have the full audio from from the 2010 version. So we won't even have to tolerate the no count computer AI narration for us. Let's see. Other folks who dialed in, see if they have commentary, and then I'll get the rest of my notes before we wrap up. *61 for other folks if they have commentary, then I'll get my notes as we wrap up for this week. Let me see, get my place back for the beginning of this section. Okay, birth of mass incarceration. Again, something about this seems massively deceptive as well, to go through this entire You're talking about the Vietnam conflict is through the 50s, you're talking about 20 years. Dr. King talking about this, Minister Malcolm talking about this, the Black Panther Party talking about this, Muhammad Ali talking about this, like all of this. And so much happens as a result of Vietnam. That's what I mean. Like, okay, so is Michelle Alexander retarded? And she just, Vietnam? What? What is that? What is that? I don't know. Tell me something about that. Tell me something about Vietnam. Is that Michelle Alexander? It'd say, oh, okay, she's just a little retarded, like most victims. No problem. Just, take all the advertisements for the book down. It's not that great. We got it. If she's not retarded, she did graduate from Stanford. You do know about Vietnam. Why did it not pop up in this section? At least just a quick, all those riots. People went to jail over Vietnam, yes? Oh, okay. Muhammad Ali could have went to jail over Vietnam, yes? Oh, okay. The drugs, war on drugs, that's not related to Vietnam. I'm being ignorant. I'm being retarded, maybe. That don't have nothing to do with Vietnam. That's what I mean. Like, it's way too much of that. Just, the Black Panther Party, they not supposed to be in this book? Really? Not the whole book. I mean, you could even get in the old patriarchal, sexist, black male, privileged black male. You can even get that in. No problem. No problem. But they not mentioning it. They didn't have nothing to say about the carceral system. Really. Okay. Let's see. Following the Civil War, party alignment was almost entirely regional. The South was solidly Democratic, embittered by the war, firmly committed to the maintenance of a racial caste system, and extremely hostile to federal intervention on behalf of African Americans. The North was overwhelmingly Republican, and while Republicans were ambivalent about equality for African Americans, pause right there. Ambivalent. And that almost, I go either way. I'm undecided. That's what I mean. That's Michelle Alexander. And we're going to get to Chicago and Jon Burge. Matter of fact, we ain't got to get that far. You're telling me that white people in Chicago in the early 20th century, late 19th century, they were so-called ambivalent about racism, white supremacy. You lying half-breed, mulatto, no count. What am I to say? Now if you read this and you're ignorant about that whole time period, oh, okay, well, limp noodle, that's what I've been saying about us. On sundown towns alone. What? White people were indifferent about the Negro. They weren't even Where did this half-breed lion author, where did she go to high school? Oregon. You can't even truthfully tell them. Now she lying or she just retarded? Now you telling me she didn't know Oregon is KKK territory? Oregon is not in the South, unless my geography is real retarded, which it might be. You can correct me, but I don't think that's in the South. Oregon, they had it in their state constitution. No niggers, no half-breeds. You and your dad, you get out of Oregon. That was in their state constitution in the 19th century. Team Limp Noodle. That's 1800s. Are you telling me that's ambivalence about the nigger? That's what I mean. Like, hey, you all can say that's cherry picking. She made some errors, inaccuracies. I'm saying Michelle Alexander is lying over and over and over and over. That's what I'm saying. She's willfully, deliberately lying to us. Even just one is, if you had to tell us in the book, not when you go out and do your old lame talks about this crap, in the book, oh yeah, I grew up in old Ashland. She ain't put that in the 10th anniversary edition. Ashland, Oregon, 0.5% Negroes. They weren't colorblind there. She ain't put that in the book. She ain't want us to disrupt all that. She could have put in the book, you know, my granddad, now he eventually did come around and support old Jesse Jackson, but initially, woo-wee, he don't do no Negroes. He ain't colorblind about it. He told my dad, don't you step Negro toe on my porch. That ain't colorblind, man. And her white family members were not in the South. Is that ambivalence? You could have picked a better word. You could have picked a more truthful term than ambivalence. Let's see. Far more inclined to adopt and implement racial justice reforms than their Democratic counterparts below the Mason-Dixon. I don't know what the F you're talking about. This, I just told you I was going to go to other locations. Oregon had a no Negro policy in the state, not in one county, not for Portland. Like no Negro, it was no Negroes for the state. What the F are you talking about? What are you talking? Why are you lying to us? Why are you lying to us? Over and over, and why is Vietnam not in this book? Let's see. He argued, Nixon, Southern white Democrats had become so angered and alienated by the Democratic Party's support for civil rights reforms. I don't even know what you're talking about there. Democratic support for civil rights? Like who? Senator James Eastland in Mississippi? That's who you're talking about? Who are you talking about? Continuing, alienated white people, desegregation and busing, that those votes could be easily persuaded to switch parties if those racial resentments could be maintained. Warren Weaver, a New York Times journalist who reviewed the book upon its release, observed that Phillips' strategy largely depended upon creating and maintaining a racially polarized political environment. That is the system of white supremacy racism. Now, I don't know what they mean by racially polarized, but I mean, hey, nothing is more polarized than the system of white supremacy racism. You always are going to have arguments and conflict how to handle the niggers. What do we do about the niggers? You certainly are not going to tell me the whole period, 1850s through the 1860s, when you got Civil War, that's racially polarized, right? And then you got Reconstruction, that's racially polarized, right? And then you got the nadir, you're lynching niggers every other day, so-called nadir, that's what they call it. That convict leasing, that's what she told. That's racially polarized. You got the NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois and all that. And you lynch Emmett Till and all that, and Brown v. Board of Ed. So when is it not racially polarized? Obese? When? System of white supremacy, period. And he continues, says, full racial polarization is an essential ingredient of Phillips' political pragmatism. He wants to see a black Democratic Party, particularly in the South, because this will drive into the Republican Party precisely the kind of anti-Negro whites who will help constitute the emerging majority. This even leads him to support some civil rights efforts. I thought this was important. Where you have racists, we want to give the impression this group is pro-Negro. Now, the white people there could be totally racist, but we just want to give the impression this organization is pro-Negro, and then that way we'll get all the white people, they'll come join us. That is, wow. Wow. Now, there you go. That's another. We play every side. I'm a race soldier, and I'm going to go support some aspects of civil rights legislation. Hope it passes. And then, hey, you see? That, and blame the other side, see? They went out, and I know I wouldn't vote for it, too. See? And then I might be the first one out there and complain that it passed. See? Master that. See, that sort of master deception, that's why I'm especially appalled by a book like this. You half-breed lion, you gonna come and add on top of this and do some more lies? We already got enough lies. We don't need no more lies. We got centuries, hundreds of years of white people lying and lying and lying and lying. You can come and add some more? We don't even need a teaspoon more lies. We just tell the truth, man. And if you're too cowardly, tell the truth, shut up. Write another book. Write a book about something else. Hey, you want to impress me, old lying Michelle Alexander? Write about being 0.5% Negro in Oregon with a white mom. Write about that, coward. Let's see. She said the law and order rhetoric fit their effort to mobilize the resentment of white working class voters. So much of this seems to be that poor white people are ignorant and stupid. That is a lie. Poor white people are in a way better position even than many of the so-called middle-class white people or whatever it is. Dr. Welsing said decades ago, white people constitute a class to themselves. Poor white people have better health outcomes than Negroes. Even you see now, poor white people get hooked on drugs. Leroy get hooked on drugs. It's going to be a totally different response. You've seen that for a decade now. All that, in my view, you're lying too. Poor white people are not treated the same, and they're not ignorant. This is not some, the rich whitey, just the puppet masters, and they dupe and lie. No, man. No, that's not what this is either. Let's see. She says during the presidential election that year, both Republican candidate Richard Nixon and the independent segregationist candidate George Wallace made law and order a central theme of their campaigns. Even there, she doesn't call George Wallace a racist. He's a so-called segregationist. She doesn't call Nixon anything, so I guess he's a good white man too, maybe? Not racist white man? I don't know. She says at the end of the ad caption, declared this time, vote like your whole world depends on it, Nixon. Viewing his own campaign, and Nixon reportedly remarked with glee that the ad hits it right on the nose. It's all about those damn Negro Puerto Rican groups out there. That sounds like it's non-white people. It ain't about poor white people. It's about dark people. Dark people. I've heard some people say, so-called Puerto Ricans, Negroes that can swim. Dark people. J-Lo, you and Diddy. Let's see. Race had become yet again a powerful wedge. This one again, in my view, you're lying, Michelle Alexander. What do you mean had become yet as though it is always about white supremacy? When is it not about white supremacy race? And again, what's in the background of all this that she's not talking about? Vietnam. That's about poor white people? That's not about racism, white supremacy, chinks, slopes. That ain't got nothing to do with it. Stop lying. And then she said, race had become yet again a powerful wedge, breaking up what had been a solid liberal coalition based on economic interests of the poor and working and lower middle class. And again, working and lower middle class is lower middle class. That's Stanford jargon. In 1968 election, race eclipsed class as the organizing principle. You are a liar, Michelle Alexander, like out of this world. Did Fannie Lou Hamer and that happen? Black people in Mississippi saying that we're not being allowed to vote and all of that. Where was the multiracial coalition then, you liar? What are you, Black Power? Did that happen during this era? How about this? I mentioned SNCC already. Did they purge white people from the party? What the F are you talking about, you half-breed liar? What are you talking about? Oh my God, this is like, it should be higher than 4. It should be, at minimum, as a Stanford grad, there's a much broader telling about, again, why are we getting this short shrift, slapdash, mediocre retelling of history that is most favorable to racists? Why? Why is this a necessary prerequisite to us hearing her tell us about Negroes getting locked up, and especially if you're going to leave out Vietnam and pertinent aspects during all of this, Black Panther Party, why? She says, she's talking about, moving on, talking about Reagan and condemning welfare. Queens, most white people are on welfare, more white people on welfare than black people. They're talking about all this fear and resentment that whites have of Negroes, as though black people had taken over in the 60s and 70s. Like, what are you all even upset about? Like, 5 Negroes moved in next door? 5 black people went to school? Like, oh, our whole world is falling apart. 5 black people moved in? Like, what? They act like black people had taken over, opened up all these businesses and banks, and all the black people driving Rolls Royces and got television networks and 15 cars and 10 garages at their house. Like, what are you talking about? Jeez, and enrolled in college and everything? Come on. Let's see. All of this with race, them echoing so-called colorblind rhetoric. Even in my view, you're talking about racism, but doing so in a refined manner. I didn't call anybody Negro. I just said we got all these mooching welfare queens. That's not colorblind. I'm being racist. Even when she gets to Neshoba County, that's another thing is, as someone who majored in history, I really do not need anybody else at this point. Ronald Reagan ran for president. What is that? We're talking about over 40, almost 50 years ago at this point. This has been talked about and rehashed over. Dr. O'Reilly wrote about this like 30 years ago. Neshoba, as have many, 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 many other scholars, and in a much more eloquent manner. We do not need Michelle Alexander, half-breed lion, coming in here. Well, we can't really say it's right. He's in Neshoba County, and this is much closer to when everything happened. He's in Neshoba County. Not even 20 years after they done killed James Chaney and them 2 white boys. And he's saying the exact same thing that the white people who killed James Chaney and them 2 white boys, states' rights, the exact same racist rhetoric that they're saying. And you're going to say, well, we can't really prove that. What? Not that I need someone, and really, all you would need is a white person, period. Hey, this is racist. You coming here, you're doing this deliberately. Yeah, you ain't called nobody a Negro, but you coming exactly to where the racists killed them, James Chaney and them 2 white boys, and you saying, using the exact justification that they gave for murdering that black James Chaney and them 2 white boys? Oh no, that's an act of racism, and you're just being refined in what you do. That's all it would take. And they would, well, they said it's racist, and that's that. Well, he got plausible deniability. Like, oh my God. Like, that's what I said. Why write a deliberately dishonest section that is most favorable to racists, and what you omit, and then even how you write about what you include, who you cite, who you don't cite? Trash, man. Let's see, and I think we'll have to get to the remainder for next Friday. Double check to make sure I did not miss any additional emails, and then *61. Any other folks have hands, thoughts to share before we wrap up this here week? As I said, we haven't even got to the main meat of the text. This is just her, slapdash, dishonest retelling of U.S. history. James Lowen, in my thought, was way more accurate than this. Douglas Blackman, way more accurate than this. Hopefully we'll like a few pages left in chapter 1, and then we'll move forward to chapter 2 next week, although I do not expect any improvements in the book as we get to the lockdown. I don't expect improvements. I just expect more lies and dishonesty as we continue. So hopefully we won't have all the chaos next week, so it'll be a little smoother transition into the live broadcast for us next Friday. Any hoodles, we will be here tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, Counter Racist Weekly review, catch up on what transpired over the past 7 days, and then we'll have updates for all the broadcasts as we push on into springtime full force 2026. Much obliged for folks tuning in, hopefully worthy of your time and energy. And if you are remembering when you read this book the first time, it's like, dang, Gus T is going crazy on this here book. Yes, it's loathsome. Were you in that number? You read the people that I'm talking about side-eyeing and they say, dang, he talking about me? Yes. Team Limp Noodle. Did you read this book first time? Did you think, what? She got a white parent. Eee. Did she mention Vietnam? Should she have? COINTELPRO, all these myriad of things. Even our listener who wrote inaccurate, and I was saying the same thing. Her telling of the New Deal and how it disproportionately helped out black people. And I was thinking, I ain't never heard that one before. I don't think that's true. In fact, they got whole books about how because the New Deal left out domestic workers, the help, they don't get all that, man, you got generations of black people who were really hammered economically because they were not included in the New Deal. That doesn't sound like disproportionate benefit for black people. Were you all thinking that when you read this, or? We'll continue. Gus T will just be more aggressive with the critiques as we roll. Sobriety would be better. Hey, book we reading, hey, put that mad dog down. They lock you up for that. Intoxicated in public. Yeah, see? Disorderly conduct, too. Open container in public, see? 15 years. They had it, and he had possession of cocaine and a few other things, too. Yes, 15 years. Repeat offender, too. Sobriety would be best. Shout to Tulia. Creator, we ask, remind us, stop saying not all white people are racist. What about Michelle Alexander's mom? John F. Kennedy, John Brown, Jane Elliott? Stop saying not all white people are racist. I'm supposed to get Tom Watson in there too. We had him today. Creator, remind us, stop name-calling black people, even if they have one white parent. Have stick with lying Michelle Alexander to describe the pattern of behavior. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. Yeah. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.